Picture yourself standing in a cobblestone courtyard at dusk, the last rays of sunlight warming your face. Now feel rough hands grab your arms. Iron shackles snap around your wrists with a sound like breaking teeth. You're being dragged backward toward a wooden door set low in a stone wall, so low you'll have to bend to enter, as if the building itself demands submission before you even cross the threshold. The guard's torch throws wild shadows across moss-covered stones, and you catch a smell rising from below human waste, mixed with something sweet and rotten like fruit left to ferment in a closed room. You probably won't survive this, but let's be honest, you wouldn't make it past breakfast. Welcome to the reality of medieval dungeon imprisonment, where everything you think you know about survival gets tested against stone cold, and the casual cruelty of people who've forgotten that screaming eventually stops meaning anything. This isn't a movie set with strategically placed mood lighting. This is architecture designed to break you slowly economically and with remarkable efficiency. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing how far these midnight history sessions travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The descent begins with stairs. Not the clean, evenly spaced steps you're used to, but irregular stone blocks worn smooth by centuries of feet. Some walking down voluntarily to deliver food, others drag down against their will. Each step down takes you further from natural light, from fresh air, from the world of the living. Your eyes struggle to adjust. The torch the guard carries illuminates maybe 6 feet ahead, which means you're walking into darkness, trusting your feet to find purchase on stone slick with moisture you don't want to identify. The temperature drops with each step, not gradually abruptly as if you're passing through invisible curtains of cold. Your breath starts to fog. The walls narrow until your shoulders nearly brush both sides, and you realize this architectural choice is deliberate. The corridor wants you to feel compressed, squeezed, reduced in size before you even reach your cell. Psychological warfare built into masonry. Historians still argue whether medieval dungeon designers consciously employed these psychological tactics or whether the oppressive architecture emerged organically from practical constraints, but the effect remains the same. You feel smaller with every step. Somewhere below, someone is coughing a wet rattling sound that goes on too long. Another voice, barely human, mutters something in a language you don't recognize, or maybe it's not language at all anymore. The acoustics down here do strange things to sound. Echoes arrive before the original noise, or that's how it feels. Your sense of direction dissolves. Are you still going down, or has the passage leveled out? The torchlight flickers, throwing your shadow in 3 different directions at once. The guard, let's call him Thomas, because historical records suggest many English dungeon keepers bore that common name stops at Nyan Gate. The lock mechanism is simple but effective, a sliding bolt as thick as your wrist operated by a key the size of a small dagger. The metal screams when he pulls it open. Nothing down here has been oiled in years. Why would it be? The prisoners certainly don't need smooth, quiet doors, and the guards have long since stopped caring about the noise. In, Thomas says, just one word. Not cruel, not kind, utterly neutral. The tone of someone performing a task they've done 1,000 times. You're not a person to him. Your inventory. Item number whatever received on this date, stored in cell number 7, status alive for now. The cell is roughly 8 feet by 8 feet. Low ceiling, you can touch it with your palm if you reach up, which you won't want to do often, because the stone up there drips constantly. The dripping has created pale mineral deposits, stalactites in miniature. Beautiful in a way that would be fascinating if you weren't about to spend an indefinite period locked beneath them. There's a small barred window high on one wall, perhaps 10 inches square, showing a slice of sky that's already darkening toward night. That window is your only source of natural light. When clouds cover the moon, you'll have nothing. The floor is bare stone uneven, with a channel carved along one edge that serves as the room's drainage system. For what exactly? Well, you're about to find out, and the answer won't improve your day. 3 other prisoners occupy this space. They look up when you enter with the expression of people who've learned not to hope for anything interesting. One is young, maybe 17, with the kind of thin face that suggests noble blood and a political miscalculation. Another is older, 40 perhaps, with hands marked by labourer, craftsman or merchant who couldn't pay a debt. The third person is harder to read, gender ambiguous, beneath layers of filthy cloth age, uncertain, sitting in the corner farthest from the door, with eyes that track movement but reveal nothing. Thomas removes your shackles, just the wrist ones, leaving the iron cuffs attached to your ankles, and steps back through the gate. The bolt slides home with that same metallic shriek. His footsteps recede up the passage, the torch glow fades, and then you're standing in near total darkness with 3 strangers who smell like they haven't bathed in months because they haven't, and neither will you. First time, the young one asks. His accent marks him as educated, probably French. You nod, then realise he can't see you in the dark. Yes, you manage. It gets worse, he says not unkindly. Just stating a fact, like mentioning that winter follows autumn. And he's right, of course. This is just the beginning, the gentle introduction to a world operating under rules your comfortable modern existence never prepared you for. Welcome to the dungeon. Population people who've stopped counting days. Duration of stay until someone remembers you exist or doesn't. The cold settles into your bones with proprietary certainty. Somewhere above the world continues markets opening bread, baking children laughing. Down here time moves differently, slower, thicker, like trying to walk through water that's gradually freezing around your legs. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First you need to understand exactly where you are, what this place is made of, and why every single architectural choice was designed to remind you that hope is a luxury you can no longer afford. The stone surrounding you isn't just stone, it's a specific kind of misery, carved from limestone or granite, depending on which region of medieval Europe claimed you. English dungeons favour limestone because it's plentiful and easy to quarry. But here's the quirk historians love to mention at academic conferences. Limestone is porous. It breathes. It absorbs moisture from the surrounding earth and weeps it back out in slow, constant tears that never stop. Your cell walls are literally crying, and they'll cry on you for months. Touch the wall beside you. Go ahead, press your palm flat against it. The stone is cold in a way that transcends temperature. It's the cold of deep earth, of places sunlight hasn't reached in geological time spans. Your hand comes away damp. Not wet exactly, but coated in a thin film of moisture that smells faintly metallic, like old blood mixed with clay. That dampness will never leave. Not your clothes, not your skin, not your lungs. Within 3 days you'll develop a cough. Within 3 weeks that cough will be permanent. The dungeon is already colonizing your respiratory system. Look up at that vaulted ceiling. Well, you can't really see it in this darkness, but run your eyes along where you remember it being. Medieval architects understood something about cold air that you probably learned in grade school and promptly forgot. It sinks. Heat rises, cold settles, and a vaulted ceiling creates a natural collection point for the coldest air in the room. Gathers up there like an invisible lake suspended over your head, and throughout the night it drips down in slow currents that find every gap in your clothing. By morning you'll understand why the other prisoners sleep curled in tight balls, knees to chest, trying to minimize surface area, exposed to air that feels actively hostile. The architecture here serves multiple purposes, and none of them include your comfort. First, practical dungeons are almost always built in the lowest level of a castle or fortification, which means they're partially or fully underground. This provides natural insulation for the fortress above your suffering, literally helps keep the Lord's bedchamber warmer. Second, psychological. The descent into earth mirrors the medieval conception of hell as a downward journey. You're not just imprisoned, you're symbolically damned, placed beneath the world of light and grace. Third, and this is where it gets interesting, is security through discomfort. Historians still argue whether medieval dungeon conditions were deliberately harsh as punishment or simply the result of indifference, but the documentation suggests both. A chronicle from 1347 describes the Tower of London's lower cells as fashioned so that prisoners might endure sufficient hardship to render escape attempts unlikely, due to weakened constitution. Translation. They kept you just uncomfortable enough that you'd lack the strength to try anything clever. The floor beneath your feet slopes slightly toward that drainage channel cut along the wall. Notice how it's angled. That's not accidental. Everything flows toward that shallow groove water waste, whatever liquid miseries accumulate in a cell housing 4 people with no sanitation facilities. The channel leads to a small hole in the corner barely visible even in daylight, which connects to a primitive sewer system that might empty into a moat or river or just a cesspit beneath the foundation. Aristocratic prisoners sometimes paid extra for cells with actual latrine chutes built into the wall holes that dropped waste directly into the moat below. You're not aristocratic enough for that privilege. The barred window I mentioned earlier deserves closer examination. It's positioned about 7 feet up the wall, which means even if you stood on someone's shoulders, you'd barely reach it. The bars are iron, each as thick as your thumb, spaced close enough that you couldn't fit your head through even if you managed to bend them. But here's what makes this window particularly cruel. It doesn't lead outside. Trace the logic of your descent. You came down at least 20 feet of stairs, maybe more. You're below ground level. That window opens into a light well, a vertical shaft that rises up through the castle's foundation to somewhere near ground level. It provides ventilation and a slice of sky, but nothing else. You cannot see the world from here. You can only see a narrow column of air that reminds you the world exists somewhere above you. During rain, water pours down that shaft and sprays through the bars, soaking everyone in the cell. During snow, the cold intensifies to levels that make your teeth ache even when your mouth is closed. During summer, and yes, you might be here through multiple seasons, the shaft becomes a chimney for heat, except the heat never quite reaches you. It hovers in the upper portion of the shaft while you remain in cool shadow, smelling bread baking in kitchens you can no longer access. The door you entered through is 3 inches of oak reinforced with iron strapping. It opens outward, which means you cannot barricade it from inside, cannot wedge anything against it, cannot apply leverage in any useful way. The hinges are on the exterior. The lock mechanism is simple but massive, no delicate picking here. Just brutal mechanical advantage that requires a key weighing more than a pound. Some dungeons feature double door systems, an outer iron gate, and an inner wooden door creating an airlock of misery. Yours has only one door, which means you'll hear everything happening in the corridor outside. Every prisoner dragged past, every scream from interrogation rooms, every conversation between guards who've stopped thinking of you as human. The walls are roughly 3 feet thick. You could shout yourself hoarse, and nobody above would hear you. Sound doesn't travel upward through stone with any efficiency, another thing the architects understood perfectly well. But sound travels beautifully through stone horizontally, which means you'll hear prisoners in adjacent cells, their coughs, their prayers, their night terrors, their final moments. The dungeon creates an acoustic community of suffering where everyone is alone together. Notice there are no wall sconces for torches or candles in here. prisoners don't get light sources. Fire risk, yes, but also why waste resources illuminating people nobody wants to see. The darkness is part of your sentence, unofficial but absolute. Your eyes will adjust somewhat, learning to distinguish between absolute blackness and the faint grey that passes for visibility when moonlight filters weakly down that vertical shaft. But you'll never see clearly again, not down here. The young French prisoner shifts position, and you hear his chains scrape stone. Everyone down here wears ankle cuffs connected by a short chain, maybe 18 inches, that allows shuffling movement but prevents running. The iron is raw, unpadded, and within days it will wear through whatever clothing covers your ankles and begin the slow work of creating permanent scars in the shape of shackles. Some prisoners develop infections at these sites. Most infections down here prove fatal because there's no such thing as antibiotics, and barely any concept of antiseptic treatment beyond cauterization, which isn't really an option when you're chained in a dungeon. This is your new home. Stone moisture, cold, and darkness arranged in precise architectural harmony, to remind you that you've fallen out of God's grace and into a space designed by people who understood that suffering doesn't require active cruelty. Sometimes it just requires really good engineering. The rustling starts about an hour after the guard's footsteps fade completely. At first you think it's one of your cellmates shifting position, but the sound is too quick, too light, and coming from multiple directions at once. Then something runs across your foot, small, warm, and utterly confident in its right to be there. Congratulations, you've just met the dungeon's actual majority population, rats. Medieval dungeons average between 20 to 40 rats per cell, according to grain consumption estimates from castle provisioning records. That's not counting the mice, which are harder to track, but probably triple that number. These aren't the nervous, skittish rodents you might glimpse in a modern alley. These are apex predators of the underground ecosystem animals that have lived alongside humans for so many generations they've lost most of their fear. They know you're not a threat. You're a food source both for what you might drop and eventually for what you'll become. The rats here are brown rats, mostly Rattus norvegicus, though the black rat shows up in earlier medieval periods before its brown cousin muscled it aside. They're sleek, well-fed creatures about 10 inches long, not counting the tail, which adds another 8 inches of naked scaly appendage that will occasionally brush against your hand in the darkness, making your skin crawl in ways you didn't know were possible. They eat better than you do, frankly. The dungeon provides them with an endless buffet of food scraps, insects each other when necessary, and human waste which contains enough undigested nutrients to keep a rat population thriving. Your cellmate in the corner, the ambiguous one who hasn't spoken, tosses something small toward the door. A rat squeaks, and 2 others rush over, fighting briefly for whatever was thrown. "Feed them away from where you sleep," the corner prisoner says, first words spoken in a voice worn smooth like river stones. "Otherwise they'll crawl on you all night checking if you're dead yet." This is the first survival lesson the rats are inevitable, so you negotiate a relationship with them. Some prisoners befriend particular rats, naming them sharing food scraps, creating the illusion of companionship with creatures that would happily eat their fingers if they stopped moving long enough. It's not insanity, it's adaptation. The human mind requires social connection so desperately that it will forge bonds with anything possessing eyes and a heartbeat. But the rats bring friends. On their fur fleas, in their waste diseases you cannot pronounce but will definitely experience. Leptospirosis enters through cuts in your skin when you touch surfaces contaminated with rat urine, which means every surface down here. Symptoms start with fever, and headache progress to kidney failure if you're unlucky. Rat bite fever comes from bites or scratches easy to acquire when you're sleeping on the floor in darkness and accidentally roll onto an animal that feels threatened. And then there's plague, the big one carried by fleas that jump from rat to human with democratic enthusiasm. cryptic. The French kid he's mentioned his name is Philippe. Son of some minor nobleman arrested for his father's debts, has developed a cough that sounds productive in the worst possible way. How long have you been here? You ask him partly to distract yourself from something crawling near your ankle. 3 months. 4. The light changes, but I've lost count. He coughs again, and even in the darkness you can sense him turning away from courtesy, trying not to spray whatever's in his lungs toward you. Too late for such niceties, really. You're all breathing the same air in this enclosed space. Whatever he has, you'll have within a week. The older man, he said his name is Edmund. A wool merchant from York, adds his perspective. The rats aren't the worst of it. Wait until the lice really establish themselves. He scratches absently at his neck, a motion so automatic it's clearly unconscious. They prefer the warm places. Hair, armpits, groin. You'll spend half your day killing them, and they'll still win. He's not exaggerating. Lice thrive in exactly these conditions: crowded humans, no bathing facilities, clothes that never get washed. Each female louse lays about 10 eggs daily, cementing them to hair shafts with a glue-like substance that survives casual attempts at removal. The eggs hatch in about a week, and the nymphs reach reproductive maturity in another week, creating exponential population growth that outpaces your ability to control it. Within a month down here, you'll host hundreds of lice. Within 2 months, thousands. The itching becomes its own form of torture. Not the sharp pain of injury, but a constant, maddening sensation that disrupts sleep concentration, any attempt at mental peace. You scratch until you bleed, and the bleeding creates new problems, because open wounds in this environment invite infection with the same certainty that flowers invite bees. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities understood the disease vector represented by overcrowded, vermin-infested dungeons, or whether they simply didn't care. Some evidence suggests awareness. A 1301 order from Edward the Crone demanded that London's prison cells be cleaned of filth and vermin quarterly, implying someone recognised the problem, even if the solution proved inadequate. Other evidence suggests profound indifference, bordering on weaponization, deliberately crowding cells to spread disease among prisoner populations that might include political enemies or religious dissidents. Your new companions have developed strategies for coexistence with the wildlife. Philippe keeps a small pile of straw in one corner. Where he got it, you don't know yet. But everything down here has value and cost, and he's trained himself to sleep, sitting up against the wall, reducing the surface area available for rats to explore. Edmund has fashioned a crude comb from a splintered bone, probably chicken, and runs it through his hair and beard systematically each morning, crushing lice between his thumbnails with practiced efficiency. The corner prisoner seems to simply accept the situation with a stillness that suggests either deep meditation or profound resignation. Then there are the spiders. Large ones, hand-sized in some cases, that build webs in the upper corners where the vaulted ceiling meets the walls. They're actually your allies in this ecosystem, eating flies and other insects that would otherwise torment you. But try explaining that to your instincts when one drops onto your face in the middle of the night. Medieval prisoners sometimes protected spiders, recognizing their role in the delicate balance of dungeon life. Kill all the spiders and the fly population explodes, bringing with it the diseases flies carry from the waste channel to any open wound you've acquired. A rat runs across your foot again, bolder this time, pausing to sniff your ankle. It's warm against your skin, body temperature running hotter than human baseline. For just a moment you understand why prisoners might welcome even this contact. It's proof that something alive still finds you interesting enough to investigate, which beats the alternative of being so thoroughly broken that even rats ignore you. The merchant Edmund makes a clicking sound with his tongue, and 2 rats immediately orient toward him. He's saved a small crust from today's bread. You haven't gotten yours yet, but we'll address that soon, and breaks it into pieces, tossing them carefully into the drainage channel. The rats scramble after them, squeaking in what might be gratitude or just excitement. "Better they eat there than over here," he explains. "Territory matters even with them." You're learning the rules of a world that operates on principles completely foreign to everything you knew 12 hours ago. The rats aren't pests to be eliminated, they're neighbours to be managed. The lice aren't a hygiene problem, they're an inevitable condition. The spiders aren't frightening, they're essential workers in an ecosystem balanced on the edge of biological collapse. Welcome to your new community. Population, 4 humans, several dozen rats, thousands of lice, and an uncertain number of spiders who may be the only things down here actually on your side. The food arrives around what you estimate is midday, though time has already become slippery in the darkness. You hear the guard's footsteps echoing down the corridor, accompanied by the scrape of something being dragged a wooden bucket you'll learn containing the day's rations for this entire cell block. Thomas appears at your door with a torch that seems blindingly bright after hours of darkness. Your eyes water immediately and you shield them with your hand while trying to see what he's carrying. 4 small loaves of bread. Well, bread is generous. They're dense, dark chunks that weigh heavy in your hand, made from barley or rye mixed with whatever the castle kitchen had available. Sometimes peas, sometimes sawdust for bulk, occasionally weevils that got milled right in with the grain. The loaf is roughly the size of your fist, which represents your primary caloric intake for the next 24 hours. There's a slight greenish tinge along one edge where mould has already started its work, but you'll learn to tear that part off. Probably. Water, Edmund says, holding up a wooden cup that's more crack than cup it seems, sealed with tar. Thomas dips it into a bucket and passes it through the bars. The water is brown. Not metaphorically brown, actually brown, carrying sediment from whatever source fed it. Could be a well, could be rainwater collected in cisterns, could be the same river that receives the castle's sewage downstream. You'll never know, and asking won't improve the answer. Each prisoner receives 1 cup. The cups get passed back through the bars, dipped again, and distributed to the next cell. You do the math, 4 prisoners, 1 cup, no soap, no cleaning between uses. Philippe drinks first, his lips touching the rim where someone in the previous cell put their mouth. Someone who might have tuberculosis or typhus, or any of the respiratory infections that turn dungeons into incubators. Then Edmund, then the corner prisoner, then you. The water tastes like minerals and something organic you'd rather not identify. It's lukewarm, slightly oily on the tongue, and it's the only hydration you'll receive until tomorrow. The bread at least is yours alone. You bite into it and immediately understand why it's so dense. It's been baked with minimal leavening, probably no yeast at all, just flour and water mashed together and heated, until it achieved a state that could technically be called cooked. It's tough enough to hurt your jaw muscles, requiring serious chewing to break down into anything swallowable. The taste is sour, earthy, with an aftertaste of iron that might be from the grain itself or from whatever metal implements touched it during preparation. Medieval prison rations were calculated by Crown officials with remarkable precision, according to exchequer records from the 1300s. The standard allotment was 1 penny per day per prisoner, which purchased approximately 1 pound of bread and 1 gallon of water. Meat appeared on festival days, maybe. Vegetables were theoretical. The goal wasn't starvation. Dead prisoners couldn't pay ransoms or stand trial, but rather minimal sustenance. Keep them alive, keep them weak. Philippe nibbles his bread, slowly making it last, a strategy you'll adopt eventually but haven't learned yet. Your modern metabolism expects 3 meals plus snacks, so right now your stomach is already growling, confused by this inadequate offering. Sometimes they bring pottage, Philippe says, seeing your expression. Thin soup with onions if we're lucky, but mostly just this. The truly wealthy prisoners' nobles arrested for political reasons or held for ransom could purchase better food from their jailers. A 1356 account book from the Tower of London lists sundry provisions delivered to the Earl of N2 chickens, 1 loaf of white bread wine cheese. The cost was extortionate, marked up several 100%, because what choice did the prisoner have pay, or eat mouldy barley bread with the common criminals? This economic system turned jailers into merchants and imprisonment into a market transaction where your social class directly determined your suffering level. You notice Edmund examining his bread carefully before eating, picking at it with dirty fingernails. Checking for stones, he explains. The mills don't always separate them from the grain. Break a tooth on one and you'll wish you'd starved instead. He finds a small pebble embedded in the crust and flicks it toward the waste channel, where a rat immediately investigates this new curiosity. The corner prisoner eats mechanically, no expression, consuming the ration like fuel rather than food. You realize you still don't know their name, gender or story. They exist in your peripheral awareness, like the rats present, but not quite engaged with the social dynamics emerging among the other 3 of you. Historians still argue whether prison authorities deliberately served contaminated or inadequate food as punishment, or whether they simply passed along whatever low-quality provisions the castle purchasing system provided for its lowest priority consumers. The truth probably varies by location and time period. Some jailers were genuinely cruel, doctoring rations with substances that caused illness. Others were merely indifferent, serving whatever arrived, and pocketing the difference if they managed to purchase supplies for less than the allocated penny per prisoner. Your bread is half gone now, and you're facing a crucial decision every prisoner learns to make. Eat it all now, and enjoy a brief period of not quite hunger, or save half for later, when the hunger becomes acute and sleeping is impossible. There's no right answer. Eat it now, and you'll regret it at midnight. Save it, and the rats might find it, or the moisture in the air will make it even mouldier, or you'll spend the next 6 hours obsessing over the saved portion, unable to think about anything else. Philippe drinks his water ration in small sips, spacing them across several minutes. Edmund downs in 3 long swallows, throat working. The corner prisoner holds the cup for a moment without drinking, and you wonder if they're praying over it or just steeling themselves for the taste. The torch retreats, taking its light with it. Thomas's footsteps fade toward the next cell. You hear him repeat the distribution process, bread and water, the prisoner's communion that sanctifies nothing, but maintains just enough biological function to justify keeping you here. Your stomach, still naive about what's coming, actually growls in appreciation for the inadequate meal. Give it 3 days and it will stop complaining, having learned that protest changes nothing. You're holding a half-eaten chunk of bread that represents the difference between survival and slow starvation. The mold tastes bitter, slightly fuzzy on the tongue, but penicillin won't be discovered for another 600 years. So you're not gaining any accidental antibiotic benefit, just consuming fungus that might or might not make you sick a lottery. You'll play every day from now on. This is your sustenance. This is what medieval authorities deemed sufficient to keep a human body functioning at minimum capacity. 1 pound of bad bread, 1 gallon of questionable water, and the promise never guaranteed that tomorrow will bring the same. Welcome to the meal plan that would send modern nutritionists into existential crisis. Your body will burn through this ration in about 6 hours, then spend the remaining 18 cannibalizing its own muscle tissue to keep your brain functioning. Within a month, you'll lose 15 to 20 pounds. Within 3 months, your body will begin consuming itself in ways that create permanent damage. But hey, at least the rats are well fed. At least the rats are. About 4 hours after the meal, though, you're only guessing based on how urgently your bladder is complaining. You face a problem that modern life never prepared you for. Where exactly are you supposed to relieve yourself? The answer is somehow both obvious and horrifying. Remember that drainage channel carved along the wall. That's your toilet shared by 4 people, visible to everyone in the cell, even in darkness, because smell has remarkable precision in enclosed spaces. There's no privacy screen, no curtain, no convention of politely looking away. The corner prisoner simply stands, shuffles over to the channel in ankle chains that scrape stone with each step, and handles their business with the casual efficiency of someone who stopped being embarrassed about bodily functions months ago. The sound echoes in the stone chamber. The smell, acidic, sharp, undeniably human, joins the existing miasma of unwashed bodies, rat droppings and mildew that forms the dungeon signature scent. You get used to it. Philippe offers reading your silence correctly. Everything down here loses its power to shock eventually. Medieval people had different concepts of privacy than we do. Public bathhouses were common. Chamber pots were emptied out windows onto streets below, and entire families often shared single-room dwellings where all biological functions occurred in communal space. But even by those standards, dungeon sanitation represented a special circle of indignity. The drainage channel is about 4 inches wide and 2 inches deep, carved with a slight downward angle that encourages liquid to flow toward that hole in the corner. Solid waste, however, often requires manual encouragement, a stick kept near the channel for exactly this purpose, used by whoever's turn it is to push accumulated matter toward the drain. You will be taking a turn with that stick, probably tomorrow. The channel empties into a vertical shaft that drops roughly 20 feet into a cesspit, or in riverside castles directly into the moat. Some fortifications featured elaborate guardrobe systems, stone chutes built into exterior walls, where waste fell freely into water below. Prisoners didn't get guard-robes. You get a trough carved by someone who understood fluid dynamics just well enough to make the waste flow away from the sleeping area mostly. Edmund moves to the channel next, and you notice he's removed his shoe more like a cloth wrapping than proper footwear to keep it clean. Smart. Your feet will be your most valuable asset down here, and infections that start in extremities can spread to vital organs with medieval efficiency. He finishes uses water from his personal cup weight. He saved some from the ration to rinse his hands, then shuffles back to his spot against the wall. The smell intensifies over the next hour as 4 digestive systems process bad bread and questionable water. There's no ventilation beyond that small barred window, which means every molecule of methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide remains trapped in here with you. Your nose will adapt somewhat the olfactory receptors, fatiguing under constant assault, but you'll never stop smelling it completely. It becomes the baseline against which all other smells are measured. Now comes the part that modern sewage systems have protected you from understanding what happens when someone develops dysentery, which is less a question of if and more when. Dysentery enters through contaminated water or food, check and causes severe diarrhea that can produce 20 to 30 bowel movements per day. That's not a misprint. 20 to 30 times in 24 hours, each urgent and watery, each requiring a shuffle to that drainage channel, while your cellmates try to sleep through the sound and smell. Philippe catches you staring at the channel with growing dread. "The merchant had it last month," he says quietly. "Nearly killed him. The corner one, he doesn't even attempt to gender them. Helped clean him when he couldn't make it to the channel anymore. That's how it works down here. We take turns being the sick one and the caretaker." Medieval medical understanding attributed dysentery to imbalanced humours, too much yellow bile, requiring treatment with cooling foods and bloodletting. The actual cause, bacterial infection from Shigella or similar pathogens, wouldn't be understood for 5 more centuries. What they did understand was that dysentery spread through shared spaces, and that recovery required hydration and rest, neither of which is adequately available in your current circumstances. The mortality rate for serious dysentery in medieval prisons probably exceeded 50%, though record-keeping wasn't precise enough to give us exact numbers. What we do have are coroner's reports from London prisons listing flux and bloody flux as causes of death with depressing frequency. A 1301 inquest noted 12 prisoners dead from flux in Newgate Prison over a 3-month period. The report's tone is administrative, noting the deaths, with the same emotional register used for documenting stolen livestock. Historians still argue whether authorities recognised the connection between sanitation and disease, or whether they operated under the assumption that illness was divine punishment for criminal behaviour. Some evidence suggests awareness a 1295 order mandated that London's Fleet Prison be cleaned of filth accumulated therein, because the stench threatens the health of passers-by. Notice the concern for passers-by rather than prisoners. The people inside weren't worth protecting, but citizens walking past deserved clean air. You finally work up the courage to use the channel yourself, shuffling over in your ankle chains, trying to maintain some shred of dignity in an inherently undignified situation. The stone edges are worn smooth by countless previous users. The channel itself has a brownish stain that no amount of water could remove, even if anyone bothered trying. You finish quickly embarrassed by something that will become routine within days. There's no toilet paper, obviously, no leaves, no cloth scraps designated for this purpose. You use your hand and whatever water remains in your mouth to rinse afterward, a practice that would horrify modern hygiene standards, but was perfectly normal in medieval contexts. Wealthy people used wool scraps, or in truly aristocratic households, moss. You have neither. Your hand will serve, and you'll learn to eat with only your right hand, keeping the left for sanitation purposes, a cultural practice that originated precisely from these constraints. The corner prisoner stands again, makes another trip to the channel. Filippo coughs wetly and spits something dark into the drainage. Edmund scratches at his groin, probably lice congregating in warm places. Every biological function that modern plumbing renders invisible and odourless becomes a shared public event down here. A constant reminder that your body is betraying you in ways it never did when you had access to actual toilets. A rat scurries along the channel's edge, investigating whatever nutrients remain in human waste. Another survival lesson the ecosystem down here is circular and complete. Nothing is wasted. Everything feeds something else. You're simultaneously consumer and consumed, predator and prey-living creature, and future meal for organisms that view your imprisonment as a convenient delivery system for food. The smell settles into your clothing, your hair, your skin. Within 3 days you won't notice it on yourself anymore, but visitors, if you're ever fortunate or unfortunate enough to receive visitors, will recoil the moment they enter the cell. You've become part of the dungeon's atmosphere now, another component in its carefully balanced system of degradation. Night arrives not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual deepening of darkness that was already profound. The small square of sky visible through that barred window fades from grey to charcoal to absolute black. And with the darkness comes cold that feels almost sentient in its determination to reach your bones. This isn't the cold of an autumn evening, or even a harsh winter day in the world above. This is subterranean cold, the temperature of deep earth and stone that hasn't seen sunlight since the castle's foundation was laid a century ago. Your breath becomes visible even in the darkness. You can't see it, but you feel it condensing on your face when you exhale. Moisture immediately freezing into tiny crystals on your upper lip. The dampness that wept from the walls all day has begun to freeze in delicate patterns, creating a thin layer of frost that makes the stone sparkle when moonlight occasionally filters down the light well. It's beautiful in a way that will kill you if you appreciate it too long. Philippe is shivering continuously now, a full-body tremor he can't control. His thin frame noble bodies, rarely built up the muscle mass that peasant labour required, lacks the insulation that Edmund's stockier build provides. "The worst part is your feet," Philippe says through chattering teeth. "They go numb first, then they hurt, then they go numb again, and that's when you should worry." He's describing the early stages of frostbite, though medieval people wouldn't use that term. They called it cold gangrene, or frostbite, and understood it could lead to blackened flesh that required amputation. A 1344 medical text recommends treating frozen limbs by gradually warming them with tepid water and wrapping them in wool soaked in wine. You have no wine, no wool, and no water beyond your daily ration, which you've already consumed. The temperature in an underground stone chamber during medieval winter could easily drop to just above freezing, around 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and stay there for months. Your body burns calories trying to maintain its core temperature, calories you're not consuming because your daily bread ration provides maybe 1,200 calories, while your shivering body demands 3,000. The math is simple and cruel. You're slowly freezing and starving simultaneously. Edmund has pulled his knees to his chest and wrapped his arms around them, creating the smallest possible profile. "Sleep sitting up if you can," he advises. "Lie down, and the cold from the stone floor goes straight through you. You'll wake up if you wake up feeling like you've been beaten." He pauses. "Also, the rats are bolder when you're horizontal." The corner prisoner has achieved something remarkable. They've somehow wedged themselves into the actual corner, where two walls meet using the 90-degree angle to support their body, while minimizing contact with the floor. It's a yoga position that looks impossibly uncomfortable but clearly serves a survival purpose. Heat loss occurs primarily through contact with cold surfaces, so reducing the contact by even a few square inches makes a measurable difference. You try sitting with your back against the wall, but the stone is so cold it feels like it's actively pulling heat from your body, vampiric in its hunger for warmth. You shift away. Try curling up like Edmund, but your ankle chains limit how tightly you can fold yourself. The iron cuffs are conducting cold directly into your flesh, creating rings of ice around your ankles that throb with a deep ache that's somehow worse than sharp pain. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities understood they were essentially torturing prisoners through exposure, or whether they simply viewed cold as an unavoidable consequence of underground imprisonment. Some evidence suggests awareness. A 1302 petition from prisoners in York Castle complained that many have perished from cold and want, and the Crown responded by ordering additional straw be provided. The straw arrived 3 months later, by which time 11 of the petitioners had died. The response demonstrated that someone understood the problem existed, even if the solution came too slowly to matter. Philippe's shivering intensifies, his teeth clicking together audibly. In the faint moonlight that occasionally illuminates the cell, you can see his breath coming in quick, shallow puffs. Hypothermia progresses in stages first, the shivering, then confusion and drowsiness, then loss of consciousness, then death. The process can take hours or days, depending on the severity of exposure and the victim's physical condition. A malnourished teenage noble isn't built for this. Edmund makes a decision. "Come here," he tells Philippa. "We'll share heat." He positions himself against the wall and gestures for Philippe to sit in front of him, back to chest, so Edmund's larger body can shelter the younger man from some of the cold. Philippe hesitates. Medieval social hierarchy made physical contact between classes complicated, but survival overrides etiquette. He shuffles over chains, scraping, and settles against Edmund's chest. "You too," Edmund says to you. "Behind me, we'll make a chain." This is how prisoners survive winter nights in medieval dungeons. They create human radiators sharing body heat in configurations that sacrifice dignity for survival. The corner prisoner doesn't join, whether from pride trauma or a survival strategy you don't understand yet, but remains wedged in their angle, somehow enduring alone what the rest of you need: community to survive. You shuffle behind Edmund, pressing your chest against his back, and immediately feel the difference. His body is warm, not comfortable, but several degrees warmer than the stone or air. You wrap your arms around his sides, and Philippe does the same to Edmund, and the three of you form a shivering human knot that pools warmth in the spaces where bodies touch. The intimacy is absolute and utterly non-sexual. This is survival touch, the kind that transcends normal social boundaries, because the alternative is literally freezing to death. You can feel Edmund's heartbeat against your chest, strong and steady. You can smell Philippe's hair sour with weeks of unwashing. You can feel both men breathing their ribs expanding and contracting, and you synchronize your own breath to match theirs without thinking about it. "We'll trade positions in an hour," Edmund says. "The person in back gets coldest, so we rotate. Fair shares of misery." His voice carries the authority of someone who's organised this before, probably many times possibly, with previous cellmates who are no longer here to tell their stories. A rat runs across your foot, you're the outside position most exposed, and you barely react. The hierarchy of threats has been firmly established: cold first, everything else distant second. The rat's warmth is almost welcome, tiny mammal body heat briefly touching your skin before scurrying away toward whatever rat business occupies the darkness. The corner prisoner coughs once a wet sound that echoes off stone. They don't ask to join the warmth chain. Maybe they've calculated that their corner position, while lonelier, provides superior thermal dynamics. Maybe they simply can't bear human touch after whatever brought them here. Maybe they're dying and don't want company for the process. The night stretches ahead, hour after hour of cold that makes sleep almost impossible, but exhaustion inevitable. Your body will eventually shut down consciousness as a mercy, but you'll wake periodically every 20 minutes or so, shocked by cold or pain, back into unwanted awareness. This cycle will repeat until grey dawn light filters down the shaft, bringing no warmth, but at least confirming you survived another night. This is winter in the dungeon. This is how people died slowly in cells that left no marks on their bodies, just cold that crept into bones and stayed there until spring came or they didn't live to see it. Morning arrives with Thomas's footsteps and the weak grey light that passes for dawn down here. The warmth chain has loosened during the night you rotated positions twice, each transition a fumbling shuffle of cold, stiffened limbs and clanking chains. Now you're alone again, slumped against the wall, and the first thing you notice is your hands, their pale fingers slightly swollen with a greyish tinge around the nails that wasn't there yesterday. The second thing you notice is that you can't quite make a fist. Your fingers bend sluggishly, reluctantly, like they're no longer fully under your control. Felipe's hands are worse. His fingers have a waxy appearance, and when he tries to flex them, he winces. "Can't feel my fingertips," he says. Voice rough from a night of breathing cold, damp air. "Haven't been able to since about midnight." He's describing the progression of cold injury first, the numbness, then the burning sensation when circulation partially returns, then the permanent damage if the tissue actually freezes. But it's not just your hands. The iron shackles around your ankles have been conducting cold directly into your flesh for 10 hours straight. Where the metal touches skin, you've developed pressure sores, raw patches, where the combination of cold, constant contact and immobility has begun breaking down tissue. Edmund notices you examining your ankles and nods grimly. "They'll get infected," he says. "Not might. Will. It's a certainty down here where every surface carries bacteria, and no wounds stay clean." The shackles themselves are remarkably simple devices. 2 iron cuffs connected by 18 inches of chain, each cuff secured with a rivet that can only be removed with proper tools. They weigh perhaps 4 pounds total, which doesn't sound like much until you've worn them continuously for days. The weight becomes considerable when you're malnourished and weak. every step requiring extra effort to lift the chain clear of the ground. But it's the constant pressure that does the real damage. Medieval blacksmiths made prison shackles with a curious attention to detail. The iron was worked smooth on the inside surface to prevent sharp edges, because wounded prisoners died before they could stand trial or pay ransoms, which defeated the whole purpose of imprisonment. But smooth iron still cuts when you wear it long enough, especially at points where bone comes close to skin, ankles, wrists, collarbones, if you're unlucky enough to wear a neck iron. Thomas appears at the door with bread and water, the same routine as yesterday. As he passes the rations through the bars, you notice Philippe struggling to grip his bread loaf. His cold-damaged fingers can barely coordinate the movement, and he drops it twice before securing it against his chest. Edmund immediately tears off a piece of his own loaf and hands it to Philippe. "Eat mine first while yours warms in your hands," he says. The gesture is pragmatic rather than charitable. A prisoner who can't use his hands becomes a burden on everyone in the cell. The corner prisoners' shackles have rubbed their ankles raw enough that you can see fresh blood seeping through the grime. They show no reaction to this, which means either they've mastered pain management through some mental technique, or more likely they're so far gone that pain no longer registers as particularly important. Both possibilities are equally disturbing. Historians still argue whether shackling prisoners served a security purpose or a punitive one. The practical answer is probably both. Ankle chains prevented running and made climbing impossible, which was relevant in castles where prisoners might otherwise attempt escape through windows or drainage shafts. But the choice to leave them on continuously, even in locked cells, speaks to a punitive mindset. The discomfort was a feature, not a bug. A 1285 survey of London prisons noted that some prisoners were kept in gyves so heavy they could not stand upright, while others wore chains that connected neck to ankles, forcing them into a permanent crouch. Your ankle chains are actually on the merciful end of the spectrum. At least you can walk shuffle, really, and achieve most normal positions. Some prisoners wore chains that weighed 30 or 40 pounds, medieval restraints designed to torture through simple physics. You try standing, which requires planting your hands against the wall and pushing upward while your legs shake with effort. The chains pull tight at maximum extension, and you have to shuffle your feet closer together to achieve anything like balance. Walking to the waist channel requires tiny steps, dragging the chain between your feet, moving like someone 3 times your actual age. This is what mobility looks like now, shuffling, halting progress measured in inches rather than strides. Philippe attempts the same maneuver and nearly falls. Edmund catches him, steadies him, helps him shuffle the few feet to the channel. The younger man's legs are trembling, visibly, muscles depleted from cold and malnutrition. "Eat your bread," Edmund instructs, the same tone a father might use with a child. "You need the calories." The shackles serve another purpose. You're beginning to understand they mark you. Even if you somehow escape the cell, walk through unlocked doors, climb to street level, you'd be immediately identifiable as an escaped prisoner. The chains announce your status from 50 feet away. They make you legally less than human in medieval law. A person in chains occupied a special category where normal rights and protections didn't fully apply. Violence against shackled prisoners carried reduced penalties because you'd already been legally degraded. Your ankles throb with each heartbeat now, the cold metal having created focal points of pain that radiate up your calves. You'll learn to adjust your sleeping position to minimize pressure on the shackles. Learn to walk with a gait that reduces the chain's pull. Learn to wrap fabric scraps around your ankles for minimal padding. If you can obtain fabric scraps which costs money you don't have, or favours you haven't earned yet. Edmund has developed thick calluses at his shackle points, raised ridges of scar tissue that provide some protection against further damage. "Takes about 2 months, he says, noticing your attention. Until then, they'll cut you daily. Keep them as clean as you can, though clean down here is relative. The corner prisoner shifts slightly, and their chains scrape stone with a sound like knives being sharpened. That sound metal on stone becomes the percussion section of dungeon life, the constant background rhythm that marks every movement anyone makes. Scrape, clink, drag. Scrape, clink, drag. The symphony of imprisoned humanity played on iron instruments in a stone concert hall. You sit back down, chains pulling at your feet, and examine the damage more carefully. The skin is broken in 2 places, weeping clear fluid that will inevitably become infected, because everything down here carries contamination. Medieval medicine would treat this with poultices made from bread, mould, honey, or wine items you don't possess. Modern medicine would prescribe antibiotics and clean dressings technologies that won't exist for 600 years. You have neither past remedies nor future solutions, just open wounds in the filthiest environment imaginable. Philippe is crying quietly, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. Not from the ankle wounds, those he has accepted, but from the realization that his hands might be permanently damaged. A noble's hands were his identity. They signed documents, held reins, wielded swords. Hands marked your class. Damaged hands meant damaged future, assuming he survives long enough to have a future. Edmund places a hand on Philippe's shoulder, says nothing. Sometimes there's nothing to say. Sometimes the only honest response to suffering is silent acknowledgement that yes, this is happening, and no, it's not fair, and no, that doesn't matter. The shackles will stay on. They'll cut deeper scar permanently, possibly cripple. That's what they're designed to do, transform your body into a map of your imprisonment, marking you as someone who fell from grace and hasn't climbed back. Welcome to permanent jewellery medieval style. You'll wear it until someone decides you don't need to anymore, and that decision has nothing to do with your suffering. 3 days into your imprisonment, you learn the dungeon's most fundamental rule. Everything has a price, and the jailer is the merchant who sets it. Thomas arrives at midday, but instead of the usual bread and water routine, he stops at your cell door and produces a small wrapped bundle from inside his leather jerkin. The smell hits you before you even see what it contains. Cooked meat, still warm fat dripping through the cloth. Your mouth waters so intensely it actually hurts. "Mutton," Thomas announces to the cell at large. "Fresh from the castle kitchen, 1 shilling. He unwraps it slightly, revealing a portion of roasted leg the size of your fist, crispy skin glistening with rendered fat. It's more calories than you've consumed in the past 3 days combined. It's also more money than Edmund the wool merchant earned in 2 weeks of honest labour before his debts caught up with him. Philippe's family had money before his father's arrest led to asset seizures. But getting messages out, arranging transfers and converting wealth into coins that can reach this cell takes time and negotiation. He stares at the mutton with naked hunger, but says nothing. The corner prisoner doesn't even look up. Edmund examines his filthy fingernails with great concentration, pretending the meat doesn't exist. "No buyers today." Thomas's voice carries no particular emotion. "This is business. He'll eat the mutton himself if nobody purchases it, or sell it to prisoners in the next cell, or take it home to his own family. The desperation of captive customers is just another market force to navigate. Shame. Won't be more until Sunday, maybe." He rewraps the bundle and moves on boots, echoing down the corridor. The smell lingers, molecular ghost of protein and fat that makes your stomach contract painfully. You're learning what medieval prisoners understood instinctively. Imprisonment isn't just captivity. It's an economic system where suffering is the currency and relief costs more than you can afford. The jailer's economy operated on principles that would make modern prison reformers weep. A 13 to 20 account book from Newgate Prison lists prices for irons removed 2 shillings, for straw mattress 6 pence per week, for candles 3 pence, For ale 1 penny per cup. For removal to better sell 5 shillings. Everything was monetized, everything negotiable, everything designed to extract maximum value from captive populations who literally couldn't shop elsewhere. Wealthy prisoners lived in comparative comfort. The Tower of London's upper floors housed nobles who brought their own furniture servants and personal cooks. They paid rent of several pounds per month for these privileges, money that went directly into the constable's pocket as supplemental income on top of his official salary. The system was so accepted that when a 1393 Reform Commission investigated corruption in London's prisons, they focused not on whether jailers charged prisoners, but whether they charged too much, a subtle but crucial distinction. Edmund breaks the silence first. My brother knows I'm here. He's trying to gather money, but the wool business isn't what it was. He's explaining maybe to you, or maybe to himself, why he can't buy the mutton, why he'll continue eating mouldy bread while the smell of roasted meat haunts his memory. Another week, maybe 2, he might send a few pence. Philippe speaks quietly. My mother will pay, if she knows where I am, if she has received my letters, if the letters were actually sent and not just dropped in the moat after I paid the courier. He's articulating the prisoner's perpetual uncertainty. You can pay Thomas to carry messages, but you can't verify they arrive. You're utterly dependent on the honesty of people who've already demonstrated their willingness to profit from your captivity. The corner prisoner finally speaks a voice like gravel. Paid him 6 pence last month for a blanket. Never came. Paid again last week for the same blanket, still waiting. Their gender is indeterminate, even hearing them speak, and you realise that might be deliberate safety and ambiguity, one more way to minimise vulnerability in a space where any perceived weakness invites exploitation. This is the jailer's leveraged monopoly power over every comfort, every necessity, every tiny amelioration of suffering. Want less painful shackles? Pay for the blacksmith's time to adjust them. Want your cell's waste channel actually cleaned? Pay for the labour. Want word sent to family that you're still alive? Pay the messenger, then pay again when the first message mysteriously fails to arrive. Want to survive winter? Pay for straw blankets, warmer clothes, access to the fire that burns in the guardroom but never in the cells. Historians still argue whether this system represented institutionalised corruption or simply medieval economics applied to prison administration. The truth is probably that the distinction didn't exist in medieval thinking. Jailers were appointed to positions that paid minimal official wages specifically because everyone understood they'd supplement their income through prisoner fees. It was the business model, not a corruption of the business model. A 1344 parliamentary petition complained that London's sheriffs were taking excessive fees from prisoners for their release for better quarters, for removal of irons and for every small necessity, but the resulting reforms simply established official fee schedules, rather than eliminating the fees entirely. The problem wasn't that jailers charged prisoners. The problem was that they charged unpredictable amounts, which offended medieval sensibilities about fair pricing. Thomas returns an hour later with the daily bread ration, and this time he pauses at your cell with a different proposition. Family visits 2 pence, he announces. If you've got people who want to see you. He's fishing, trying to determine which prisoners might have resources worth extracting. Felipe perks up immediately. His mother, if she received word, would absolutely come. Edmund considers calculating whether his brother could spare 2 pence on top of whatever he's already trying to gather. When? Philippe asks. When they show up and pay me, Thomas replies. I'm not running a charity. You want them to know you're here, cost you another penny to send word. He's building a transaction chain 1 penny to send the message 2 pence for the visit. When if it happens, and probably another fee you haven't learned about yet for speaking through the bars, without time limits or supervision. You watch Philippe do the mathematics of desperation. 3 pence total for a few minutes with his mother, the chance to coordinate legal defence or ransom negotiations, the opportunity to receive money that might buy food, blankets, hope. 3 pence is 3 days of official prisoner rations, but what value do you place on seeing a loved face in hell? I'll pay, Philippe says quietly. Both. The message and the visit. Thomas nods, makes a mark on a small wax tablet. He carries a record of debts, payments, transactions that will be settled when Felipe's mother arrives, if she arrives. The jailer is running a complex credit system in his head, tracking what each prisoner owes, what they might be able to pay, calculating risk and potential profit with the skill of any medieval merchant. You. Thomas looks at Edmund, then at you, then at the corner prisoner. Edmund shakes his head. You have nothing to offer, no family who knows you're here, no wealth to access. The corner prisoner doesn't even acknowledge the question. Thomas shrugs and moves on. In the silence after his departure, you understand another layer of the dungeon's architecture. It's not just stone and iron, but economics and leverage supply and demand monopoly power, exercised over people who have no choice but to participate in a market rigged entirely against them. Philippe looks slightly less hopeless now, clinging to the possibility of his mother's face on the other side of those bars. Edmund looks more defeated, calculating how many weeks until his brother might gather enough money to matter. The corner prisoner returns to their blank examination of nothing, having learned long ago that hope costs more than they can afford. Welcome to the jailer's economy, where suffering is inventory, relief is product, and you're both customer and commodity simultaneously. The first night you actually manage to sleep, not the fitful half-consciousness, punctuated by cold and pain, but genuine sleep, you wake up screaming. Not from a nightmare, though those will come later, but from the physical reality of where you've been lying. The stone floor has pulled so much heat from your body that your left side has gone completely numb, and when sensation returns, it arrives as a burning stabbing pain that feels like being attacked by invisible hornets. Philippe and Edmund barely stir at your outcry. The corner prisoner doesn't react at all. Screaming is normal down here. You try to stand and discover your left leg won't cooperate. The muscles have cramped into rigid knots, and pins and needle sensation spreads from your hip to your toes as circulation struggles to restore itself. You lean against the wall, mistake it's equally cold, and wait for your body to remember how to function. This takes approximately 10 minutes, during which you seriously contemplate whether dying might be less uncomfortable than continuing to experience physical existence. First week is the worst Edmund offers from the darkness. His voice suggests he's been awake the whole time or never fully sleeps anymore. Your body hasn't learned yet. Give it another few days and you'll master the art of sleeping without actually resting. It's a skill like any other. He's describing something medieval people understood better than we do. The body can adapt to truly terrible conditions if it has no choice. Prisoners learned to sleep in positions that minimized contact with cold surfaces, to wake themselves periodically to shift position before permanent numbness set in to achieve a state somewhere between sleeping and waking that allowed minimal rest without ever fully surrendering consciousness. It wasn't good sleep. It was survival sleep, the bare minimum to keep your brain functioning and your body from shutting down entirely. The dungeon's sleeping arrangements make modern prison conditions look luxurious. You have no mattress, no padding of any kind unless you've purchased straw from Thomas, and you've seen the quality of that straw damp and half-rotted, barely better than lying on stone directly. You have no pillow except your own arm, which goes numb within an hour, and stays numb for hours after you move it. You have no blanket except your own clothing, which is inadequate for surface temperatures, let alone underground cold. Philippe has developed a technique where he positions himself in the fetal position, with his back against the wall, creating a smaller profile for heat loss. But this means his hip bone presses into stone for hours, creating a pressure point that's already showing signs of breakdown. The skin there is red and tender on its way to becoming an open sore that will never heal in this environment. Edmund sleeps sitting up, spine against the wall head, drooping forward onto his chest in a position that looks like medieval torture, but apparently works for him. The corner prisoner has achieved something remarkable. They sleep standing in their corner, wedged into the angle, using the walls to support their weight while minimizing contact with the cold floor. It looks impossible, but they've been doing it long enough that it's clearly sustainable, at least for someone who's given up on comfort entirely. A record from 1356 describes prisoners in Exeter Castle sleeping 3 to a space scarcely sufficient for one lying upon each other for warmth. This wasn't metaphorical. Prisoners actually stacked themselves like firewood, the bottom person bearing the weight of 2 others, in exchange for warmth from above. Crushing discomfort was preferable to hypothermia. The arithmetic of medieval survival didn't include dignity in its calculations. You attempt Edmund's sitting position spine against weeping stone and immediately understand why he's developed the shoulder calluses you noticed earlier. The wall isn't smooth, it's rough-hewn limestone with projections and irregularities that dig into your back like accusatory fingers. But lying down means full-body contact with the floor, which has already demonstrated its ability to pull heat from your flesh with vampiric enthusiasm. Sitting at least minimizes the surface area. Sleep arrives in strange fragments. You drop into unconsciousness for what feels like hours but is probably minutes, then jerk awake when your head falls forward too far and your neck protests. You drift away again, dream of warmth and food and your mother's voice, then wake to darkness and the sound of Philip coughing wetly into his arm. Time becomes nonsensical. Has it been 2 hours or 6? Impossible to tell in a space where darkness is constant, and the only clock is the gradual intensification of cold as night deepens. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities understood they were sleep-depriving prisoners as a form of torture, or whether sleeplessness was simply an unavoidable consequence of the conditions. Some evidence suggests awareness interrogators often questioned prisoners at night, when exhaustion made resistance more difficult. But the chronic sleep deprivation of dungeon life probably wasn't consciously weaponized. It was just another layer of suffering that emerged naturally from the architecture of stone and cold. Modern sleep science would classify what you're experiencing as severe sleep fragmentation, periods of unconsciousness too brief to achieve restorative REM cycles, interrupted by micro-awakenings caused by pain, cold, and discomfort. This type of disrupted sleep causes cognitive impairment, comparable to total sleep deprivation. Plus it prevents your body from healing daily damage. Wounds don't, close immune function declines, mental acuity fades. You become progressively less capable of surviving, which makes tomorrow's survival even harder, which makes the next day worse still. A rat runs across your foot, you've stopped reacting to this, and you hear it climbing Edmund's leg, investigating whether he's dropped any food. He makes a quiet clicking sound, and the rat retreats. This is his learned behaviour calling off rodents like training very small disease-carrying dogs. In the absolute darkness, these sounds create a map. The rat's claws on stone tell you it's moving toward the corner prisoner. The corner prisoner's exhale tells you they're awake, or at least not dead. Felipe's periodic coughing tells you he's still fighting whatever respiratory infection is colonizing his lungs. You try lying on your right side, now giving your left side time to recover. The floor is somehow even colder than you remembered, as if it's been waiting for you to return so it can resume its heat theft. Your hip bone makes contact with stone and immediately begins protesting. You'll shift again in 20 minutes, then again 20 minutes after that, spending the entire night rotating through positions like a rotisserie chicken that's being frozen instead of cooked. This is sleep in the dungeon, not rest, but a battle. Your body fights every night. A battle you never win, only survive until morning arrives and you can celebrate the achievement of not dying during the night. The bar for success has been lowered to simply maintaining biological function. Everything else, comfort, peace, actual rest, belongs to a different world, the one you left behind when those iron gates closed. Felipe's cough intensifies the wet, rattling sound that suggests fluid in his lungs. Edmund shifts position, chains scraping. The corner prisoner remains motionless in their standing sleep, either achieving some meditative state or simply too far gone to experience discomfort anymore. And you lie there on your side, feeling cold seep into your bones, understanding with perfect clarity why medieval prison records list weakness and infirmity as causes of death almost as often as specific diseases. You're not sleeping. You're just dying more slowly than you would if you stayed awake. On your 5th day, you think it's the 5th, but time has become slippery. Thomas arrives with someone else. Not the usual food delivery, but a deliberate visit. The second man is better dressed, carrying keys that mark him as someone with authority. He examines your cell through the bars with the expression of a merchant inspecting livestock, then points at Philippe. That one. Bring him. Thomas unlocks the door and enters the cell, and Philippe's face goes white. Not pale white, the colour of absolute terror. Edmund reaches out and squeezes Philippe's shoulder, once a gesture that communicates either comfort or goodbye, possibly both. The corner prisoner watches with those blank eyes that have seen this before and know what it means. "Where are we going?" Felipe's voice cracks on the last word. "Questions," the well-dressed man says. Just that one word, but it contains volumes. Medieval legal procedure required confession, and confession required interrogation, and interrogation had methods that made strong men weep before they even reached the torture chamber proper. You're about to learn what happens in the oubliette, though not by experiencing it directly, not yet. The oubliette, from the French oublier, meaning to forget, represents medieval dungeon architecture at its most deliberately cruel. It's a bottle-shaped cell, narrow at the top with a single hole for entry, widening into a chamber below. Prisoners were lowered in through the top opening and left there sometimes for days, sometimes for years. The shape made climbing out impossible. The depth, often 20 feet or more, meant you lived in total darkness even when the trapdoor above was open, and the name told you everything about your prospects you were there to be forgotten. Philippe is led away, his chains scraping stone with a sound that continues long after he's disappeared from view. The door clangs shut. Edmund and you sit in silence while the corner prisoner returns to their motionless examination of nothing. Time passes an hour, maybe 2. Then the screaming starts. It's distant, muffled by stone and distance, but unmistakable. A voice pushed past normal human volume by pain that overrides self-preservation dignity and every learned behaviour about maintaining composure. The scream goes on too long, cuts off abruptly, then resumes at an even higher pitch. It's Philippe's voice, though barely recognisable, stripped of everything that made it human except the capacity to express suffering. Edmund closes his eyes, and his lips move silently, praying probably, though, whether for Philippe or for himself or just for this to stop is unclear. You discover something disturbing about yourself. After the initial shock, the screaming becomes almost background noise, like the dripping water or the rat's movements. The human capacity to adapt to horror is remarkable and terrible in equal measure. Strappado probably, Edmund says quietly, or thumb screws to start. They begin with the smaller tortures, save the rack for later if you don't confess quickly enough. He speaks with the authority of someone who's either experienced this directly or heard enough screams to deduce the method from the sound. The strappado dislocates your shoulders. They tie your hands behind your back, attach the rope to a pulley, and hoist you off the ground. Then they drop you part way and catch you before you hit the floor. The jerk pulls your arms from their sockets. You don't want this information, but it arrives anyway, unwanted knowledge that will live in your memory forever. The screaming continues a symphony of suffering that follows no musical structure, just rises and falls as the interrogators apply and release whatever implement they're using on Felipe's teenage body. Medieval torture wasn't randomly sadistic, it was systematically cruel, developed over centuries into a science of pain that maximized suffering while minimizing death. A 1311 interrogation manual lists recommended techniques. Begin with fear, showing the instruments. Progress to pain if confession not forthcoming. Apply gradually, allowing recovery between applications. Extract specific details to ensure confession veracity. The goal was confession that would hold up in court, detailed enough to be credible, extracted through methods that everyone involved pretended were regrettable, but necessary for truth. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed torture produced reliable confessions, or whether they recognized its coercive nature, but used it anyway because the legal system demanded confession for conviction. Some evidence suggests awareness of the problem. A 12th of a 15 church council condemned judicial torture, though the prohibition was widely ignored in practice. Other evidence suggests genuine faith in torture's truth-revealing power, a belief that physical suffering burned away lies and revealed authentic guilt. Philippe's screaming has diminished to sobbing now, the kind of crying that suggests he's broken, that whatever they wanted him to say, he's saying it, inventing details if necessary, confessing to crimes real or imagined, anything to make the pain stop. This is torture's horrible efficiency. Everyone confesses eventually. The question is only how long you last before your body or mind surrenders. The sobbing fades to silence, which is somehow worse than the screaming. Silence means either he's unconscious or they've moved to a torture that doesn't permit vocalization, the water torture perhaps, or the boot that crushes feet. Or silence means he's dead, though that seems unlikely this early in the process. Dead prisoners can't pay ransoms or stand trial, and medieval interrogators understood that keeping the subject alive required careful calibration of suffering. Edmund's prayers have stopped. He sits with his head in his hands, shoulders slumped. You realize this could be him tomorrow, or you, or even the corner prisoner who seems too far gone to have information worth extracting. The randomness is part of the terror. You don't know if you're safe or simply waiting your turn. Hours pass. The sounds from below don't resume. Eventually, Thomas returns alone, locks the cell door behind him, and looks at you and Edmund with an expression that might be sympathy, or might just be exhaustion from a long day of facilitating torture. He'll be back in the morning, Thomas says. They didn't kill him. This is apparently meant to be reassuring. Did he confess? Edmund asks. Thomas shrugs. They all confess. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter by that point. He leaves, taking his torch and his casual honesty about the brutality he participates in. Night arrives. You and Edmund and the corner prisoner sit in darkness, each processing the knowledge that Felipe is somewhere below you, literally below, deeper in the castle's foundation, experiencing pain that turned him from a person into a screaming animal and then into silence. You imagine him in the oubliette's darkness, body broken, waiting to be forgotten or retrieved, whichever comes first. The corner prisoner speaks first words in hours. Some come back, some don't. The ones who come back are different. Their voice carries the weight of experience, suggesting they've seen this cycle before, watched cellmates disappear downward and return upward, transformed by torture into something that looks human but no longer quite is. You don't sleep that night. Edmund doesn't sleep. The corner prisoner might sleep. Their standing position makes it hard to tell, but probably not. You all wait in darkness for morning for Thomas to bring Felipe back, or not bring him back for the universe to reveal whether your cellmate survived his descent into the forgotten place. The rats continue their business unconcerned with human drama. Water drips, stone weeps, The dungeon breathes its cold breath. And somewhere below, in a bottle-shaped cell designed to make prisoners disappear from both geography and memory, Philippe exists in darkness, absolute learning what it means to be forgotten while still alive. Morning brings Philippe back, though Philippe isn't quite the right word anymore. Thomas and another guard half carry half drag him into the cell and drop him on the stone floor, where he collapses into a position that suggests every part of his body is screaming independently. His hands are wrapped in filthy cloth that's seeping blood. His face is swollen, one eye completely shut, lips split in multiple places. But it's his shoulders that draw your attention. They're wrong, somehow positioned at angles that human shoulders shouldn't achieve, hunched forward as if his body is trying to fold in on itself. Strappado, Edmund confirms, quietly kneeling beside the broken boy. Both shoulders dislocated, probably. Philippe, can you hear me? Philippe makes a sound that might be acknowledgement or might just be pain given voice. His breathing comes in short, shallow gasps, each inhale ending with a small whimper he can't suppress. The strappado was considered a light torture in medieval taxonomy. It rarely killed left. No permanent visible scars if done carefully and could be repeated multiple times. The technique was simple. Bind the prisoner's wrists behind their back, attach them to a rope running through a ceiling pulley, then hoist them upward until their feet leave the ground. Their full body weight hangs from their shoulder joints, which aren't designed to support that load in that configuration. Most prisoners lasted perhaps 20 minutes before their shoulders dislocated with sounds like green wood snapping. But interrogators rarely stopped at simple suspension. The added weights to the prisoner's feet 20 pounds, sometimes 40, increasing the downward pull, or they employed the technique called squassation, hoist the prisoner up, then suddenly release the rope partway, catching them before they hit the ground. The jerk was catastrophic, tearing ligaments, wrenching joints, occasionally breaking vertebrae if the drop was miscalculated. Edmund is trying to examine Philippe's shoulders, but even the lightest touch makes the young man cry out. "We need to reduce the dislocations," Edmund says, looking at you. "Get the shoulder joints back into their sockets before the swelling makes it impossible. But it's going to hurt him more than he's already hurting. You don't want this responsibility. You have no medical training beyond basic first aid that won't be invented for 6 centuries. But Edmund is right, dislocated shoulders that aren't reduced promptly can lead to permanent damage, nerve injury, vascular compromise. Not that medieval people understood those terms, but they knew that soldiers whose shoulders were put back quickly often recovered, while those left dislocated for days sometimes never regained full use of their arms. Medieval medical texts describe the reduction technique. Lay the patient on their back, place your foot in their armpit for leverage, grasp their wrist, and pull steadily while rotating the arm until the joint pops back into place. The description makes it sound clinical. The reality is that you're inflicting agony on someone who's already been tortured, using pain to fix damage caused by pain, and the patient's screams will haunt you regardless of whether you succeed. Philippe is barely conscious, which is actually helpful. Edmund positions himself at one shoulder while instructing you to take the other. "On 3, he says. "Pull straight and steady, don't jerk it. The joint will resist, then suddenly give way. Hold him down, he'll try to fight us." The corner prisoner moves for the first time in hours, coming over to press their weight on Philippe's chest and legs, preventing him from thrashing. This is the most engagement you've seen from them, and you realise it's probably motivated by necessity. A cellmate with useless arms becomes everyone's burden. 1. Edmund counts. Philippe's good eye focuses slightly recognition of what's about to happen, producing a fear that transcends his existing pain. 2. You grip his wrist, feel the fragile bones beneath swollen flesh, and understand you're about to hurt someone who's already been hurt beyond measure. 3. You pull. The shoulder resists with surprising strength, as if the body itself is trying to maintain this broken configuration rather than face the pain of correction. You pull harder, feeling the joint grinding, and Felipe screams, a sound that has nothing human left in it. Pure animal distress that makes every instinct scream at you to stop. But you keep pulling, and suddenly something shifts with a wet pop that you feel through your hands, and the shoulder is back where it belongs. Felipe goes limp unconscious, which is a mercy. Edmund is working on the other shoulder now, and you're grateful to not be the one inflicting this particular agony. Another scream that cuts off abruptly as consciousness abandons Felipe entirely. Another pop. Edmund sits back, breathing hard, and examines his work. Best we can do, he says. They'll heal, probably, if infection doesn't set in, if he survives long enough for healing to matter. Historians still argue whether medieval interrogators understood the long-term damage they inflicted, or whether they genuinely believed torture could be applied moderately without lasting harm. Legal texts from the period refer to torture, leaving no permanent marks, which was technically true of the strappado, if you ignored that the victim might never again lift their arms above their head, without pain, might develop chronic shoulder instability, might experience nerve damage that caused numbness and weakness for life. Felipe's hands still wrapped in bloody cloth are another matter. Edmund carefully unwraps them and reveals damage that makes you look away. The thumb screws have crushed the flesh around his thumbnails, splitting the nail beds, creating wounds that are actively oozing blood and clear fluid. The thumbscrew was elegant in its simplicity, two metal plates connected by a screw mechanism that slowly compressed the victim's thumb between them. Turn the screw gradually, and you could spend an hour extracting confession each turn, producing fresh agony, while rarely causing fatal injury. We need to clean these. Edmund says, though clean is relative in an environment where the cleanest water available is the daily drinking ration, and every surface carries contamination. He uses spit, his own saliva being marginally less filthy than water from the drainage channel, and carefully wipes away the blood, revealing flesh that's pulped and mangled, but at least not actively bleeding anymore. The corner prisoner produces something unexpected, a small strip of cloth relatively clean from somewhere in their layers of clothing. They hand it to Edmund without comment. Edmund tears it into strips and wraps Philippe's thumbs as gently as possible, creating crude bandages that will do almost nothing to prevent infection, but at least cover the wounds from direct contact with the cell's filth. Philippe remains unconscious, and this is probably the best thing that could happen to him right now. Sleep, even pain-induced unconsciousness, is the only escape available. His body can attempt repairs, his mind can retreat from trauma, and for a few hours he doesn't have to be aware of what's been done to him, or what might come next. You sit back against the wall, hands shaking from adrenaline and horror. You've just participated in medieval emergency medicine, which consisted of hurting someone to help them using pain as the tool to fix pain's damage. Your hands still feel the sensation of that shoulder joint popping back into place, and you know that feeling will live in your tactile memory forever. Edmund checks Felipe's pulse at his neck strong enough, which means his heart is still committed to keeping this body alive despite its best interests. He'll wake in a few hours, Edmund predicts. The pain will be extraordinary. There's nothing we can do about that except keep him from hurting himself worse. The corner prisoner returns to their corner, having expended their allotment of engagement with other humans for the day. They've seen this before, probably participated in previous shoulder reductions, probably watched other broken cellmates return from interrogation, only to die days later from infections that began in torture wounds. Their emotional distance isn't cruelty, it's survival strategy, refusing to invest feeling in people who might not survive long enough to justify the emotional expenditure. Thomas arrives with the daily bread, sees Philippe unconscious on the floor, and shows no reaction. He confessed, Thomas mentions casually, Whatever they wanted to know, he told them. Trial next week, probably. This is the torture's goal achieved: confession. Extracted legal process satisfied, everyone can now pretend that justice is being served. Whether Philippe actually committed whatever crime he confessed to is irrelevant. He said the words they needed to hear, and those words will be used against him in whatever proceeding determines his fate. Medieval law required confession for many convictions, and torture was the accepted method of obtaining it. The system ate people and called it justice. Philippe wakes around midnight, which you know only because the screaming starts again, not from torture this time, but from the simple act of consciousness returning to a body that's been systematically destroyed. Every nerve ending in his shoulders, hands, and probably his entire torso is firing pain signals simultaneously. And there's no morphine, no painkillers beyond the willow bark tea that wealthy people can afford, and prisoners certainly cannot access. There's only the raw, unmediated experience of a body reporting its damage in the loudest possible terms. Edmund tries to calm him, speaking in low tones, but Philippe is beyond language now. He's crying and hyperventilating, his remaining good hand clutching at his chest. As panic compounds physical agony, you recognize the signs of a trauma response, what modern medicine would call shock, or acute stress reaction, what medieval people simply called broken by torture. The mind retreats when the body can't escape, creating a dissociation that serves no useful purpose but happens anyway because the brain has limits to what it can process. Breathe. Edmund keeps saying, holding Philippe's uninjured hand. Just breathe. You're alive. You survived. These words are meant to comfort, though being alive in this context is questionable mercy. Philippe's shoulders will heal poorly, leaving him with chronic pain and limited mobility. His thumbs may never function correctly again. And the psychological damage, the knowledge that his own body could be weaponized against him, that pain could be inflicted systematically by people who felt nothing while doing it. That damage has no healing timeline. The corner prisoner speaks from their usual position. They'll come for him again if the confession wasn't detailed enough, or if they decide they want more names. The first session is rarely the last. Their voice carries grim certainty, the kind that comes from watching this pattern repeat with previous cellmates. They're not being cruel, just honest about what comes next in the dungeon's established rhythm. Philippe's panic intensifies at these words. He tries to sit up, fails, falls back with a cry that echoes off stone walls. His breathing accelerates toward hyperventilation, and Edmund recognizes the danger panic attacks can spiral into loss of consciousness. And right now, consciousness is the only thing keeping Philippe's damaged body motivated to continue its repair processes. Look at me, Edmund commands, voice suddenly sharp with authority. Philippe, look at me. The young nobleman's one functional eye focuses on Edmund's face. You're going to breathe when I breathe. Watch my chest. In, out, in, out. He exaggerates his breathing, making it visible even in the darkness, and Philippe, desperate for any anchor in the chaos of his pain, tries to match the rhythm. This is medieval cognitive behavioral therapy, though nobody would call it that for another 7 centuries. Edmund is using the only tools available, his voice, his presence, and the fundamental human need for social connection, even especially in extremity. It works gradually. Philippe's breathing slows from panicked gasping to merely rapid. The crying continues but becomes quieter, more controlled, transitioning from hysteria to grief. Tell me about your mother, Edmund says, still holding Philippe's hand. What does she look like? This is deliberate redirection, pulling Philippe's attention away from present agony toward memory, toward something that existed before this cell and might exist after it. Philippe's voice comes out, broken, slurred by his swollen lips. Tall, she's tall, brown hair with grey now. She sings while she embroiders. Badly. Can't carry a tune. He's crying while he talks, but Talking helps, gives his mind something to process besides pain. She wanted me to study law. I wanted to be a knight. Stupid. Should have studied law. You're witnessing trauma, processing in real time the mind, trying to make sense of catastrophe by reaching for the familiar. Philippe is rebuilding his identity. He's someone who has a mother who sings badly, someone who made choices about his future, someone who exists beyond this cell and this pain. Whether that identity survives what's been done to him is another question entirely. Medieval understanding of psychological trauma was limited but not absent. Medical texts described melancholia that could follow severe ordeals, a condition characterized by withdrawal, inability to eat, and sometimes a wasting away that killed without obvious physical cause. We'd call it PTSD depression, or the breakdown of will to live. They called it losing your soul, which was metaphorically accurate even if the mechanism was misunderstood. A 1287 chronicle describes a prisoner released after torture who spoke not for 3 months following, and when speech returned knew not his own name nor his family. This was brain injury from trauma, but medieval observers interpreted it as demonic possession or divine punishment. The outcome was the same regardless of interpretation. Torture broke people in ways that never fully healed. Creating ghosts who walked around in bodies that technically still functioned. Philippe's breathing has stabilized, though his pain clearly hasn't diminished. He's learning what every torture survivor learns: pain is a constant that you exist alongside rather than escape from. You don't overcome it or defeat it. You simply continue breathing while it happens moment by moment, hour by hour, until either death arrives or the pain becomes slightly less catastrophic. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities understood the psychological destruction they caused, or whether they viewed torture as a purely physical act with purely physical consequences. Some evidence suggests awareness. A 1311 manual advises interrogators to allow recovery between sessions lest the prisoner lose reason, permanently rendering further questioning impossible. This implies recognition that minds could break even if they didn't articulate what that breaking meant in terms we'd recognize. Edmund keeps talking to Philippe, asking questions about his childhood, his siblings, his home. Philippe answers haltingly, words coming with obvious effort, but the conversation serves its purpose. It's something to do besides experience agony, a lifeline to a self that existed before torture. Redefined his understanding of what bodies could endure. You contribute to the conversation, eventually asking about his family's estate, the countryside he grew up in. Anything to keep the dialogue moving. The corner prisoner remains silent, but is clearly listening, and you wonder what memories they're accessing, what lost identity they might once have had before the dungeon stripped it away. The rats continue their nighttime activities, and one approaches Philippe's prone form with interest. Edmund waves it away gently, no sudden movements that might startle Philippe into forgetting to breathe. The rat retreats, but doesn't go far, waiting with the patience of creatures who understand that all human resistance eventually fails. Philippe's consciousness begins to fade again, exhaustion overwhelming even pain's ability to keep him awake. This is mercy, the body's circuit breaker tripping before damage becomes fatal. His breathing deepens, the tension in his body releases slightly, and he drifts into something that might be sleep, or might be his brain temporarily shutting down non-essential systems to focus resources on survival. Edmund continues, holding his hand for a while, after Philippe loses consciousness, a gesture that serves no practical purpose, but fulfills some need for human connection that persists even here. Then he gently places Philippe's hand on his chest and returns to his own spot against the wall. He'll either survive this or he won't, Edmund says quietly, speaking to you and the corner prisoner and maybe himself. We've done what we can. The rest is up to his body and whatever god pays attention to people in dungeons, if any. The night continues endless and cold, marked by Felipe's occasional moans and the steady drip of water down stone walls. You've witnessed torture's aftermath, now seen what systematic cruelty does to a teenage body and mind, and you understand with absolute clarity that what happened to Felipe could happen to you tomorrow or the next day. The randomness is part of the control, nobody knows who's next, so everyone lives in anticipatory dread, which is its own form of torture that requires no implements at all. Welcome to the rack's geometry translated through human flesh. This is what medieval justice looked like when it needed confession and didn't care how it got them. 2 days after Felipe's return, Thomas arrives with a new proposition and observation of an execution. Not participation, observation. "Lord's Justice tomorrow at noon in the courtyard," he announces. 2 shillings per prisoner who wants to see it. His voice carries no moral weight, just the merchant's tone of someone offering a product to potential customers. You don't immediately understand why anyone would pay to watch an execution, but Edmund's expression suggests this isn't purely sadistic entertainment. "Who's being executed?" Edmund asks. "Heretic burned." Thomas provides minimal detail because minimal detail is all that's needed. Medieval executions were public events, theatrical demonstrations of authority that served multiple purposes: punishment, deterrence, entertainment, and religious instruction, all rolled into one carefully choreographed performance. For prisoners who might never see the outside world again, even witnessing death was preferable to remaining in the cell's darkness. The corner prisoner speaks, surprising everyone. "I'll pay." They produce coins from somewhere in their clothing, where they kept them hidden, how they obtained them, these questions go unasked. 2 shillings is significant wealth down here, representing weeks of food purchases or months of small comforts. Spending it on temporary freedom from the cell reveals something about priorities when you've been buried alive for months or years. Thomas nods, makes his mark on the wax tablet. "Anyone else?" Philippe can't go. He's barely conscious shoulders, still screaming thumbs, weeping infection that Edmund tries to manage with spit and prayers. Edmund considers calculating resources he doesn't have. You have nothing to offer, so the question doesn't apply to you. The next day, Thomas arrives with additional guards and chains. Not the ankle shackles you already wear, but a longer chain that connects multiple prisoners together in a line. The corner prisoner is led out shuffling in their familiar gait, and you catch a glimpse of sunlight filtering down the corridor from some distant source. The brightness is shocking after days of darkness, and even that indirect glow makes your eyes water. They're gone for perhaps 3 hours. When the corner prisoner returns, they're different somehow, not transformed, but carrying something that might be satisfaction, or might just be the exhausted relief of having seen sky. They don't speak about what they witnessed, but that night they eat their bread ration with something that almost resembles appetite, as if the execution reminded them that being alive still means something even here. You piece together what medieval execution procedures looked like from Edmund's knowledge and the corner prisoner's silence. Burning was reserved for heretics and occasionally witches, crimes against God rather than merely against crown or community. The process was elaborate. The condemned was led to a stake, often given opportunity to recant and receive a merciful death by strangulation before the fire was lit. If they refused to recant, they burned alive, which could take 20 minutes or longer, depending on wind and how the wood was stacked. Medieval crowds gathered for executions the way modern crowds gather for concerts. Vendors sold food. Children played between adult legs. Couples courted, merchants conducted business. Death was entertainment, but also instruction. This is what happens when you challenge the established order. When you think thoughts, the church deems dangerous when you forget your place in the social hierarchy. The body's destruction was just the visible component of a message being delivered to everyone present. A 1301 account describes an execution in London where, The crowd numbered in thousands, and many stood upon roofs and walls for better viewing, and some fell to their deaths in the pressing, these being counted as additional casualties of the heretic's evil influence. This casual acceptance that people might die while watching someone else be killed reveals medieval attitudes toward mortality that modern sensibilities struggle to comprehend. Philippe is conscious more often now, though consciousness brings him no joy. His shoulders are healing, but healing means the damaged tissues are knitting back together imperfectly, creating scar tissue that will limit his range of motion forever. He tries to lift his arms above shoulder height and can't. The pain stops him before the joint's resistance does. His thumbs have swollen to twice normal size, the nails turning black as blood trapped beneath them slowly dies. They'll fall off, eventually, maybe grow back, maybe not. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practitioners understood infection in any meaningful sense, or whether they attributed fever and swelling to imbalanced humours. The practical treatments were sometimes accidentally effective. Honey on wounds, genuinely antibacterial wine washes alcohol, providing some antiseptic benefit, and keeping the injury clean helpful, regardless of the theoretical justification. But mostly wounded prisoners either healed through sheer biological persistence or died from sepsis with very little middle ground. Edmund has been monitoring Philippe's wounds with the vigilance of someone who's watched infections kill before. "The thumbs are angry," he reports using medieval terminology that's more accurate than it sounds. Angry wounds, red-hot, swollen, indicated the body's immune response fighting bacterial invasion. If the anger spread up the arm in red lines, that meant the infection had entered the bloodstream, which meant death was coming within days. Philippe's thumbs remain locally angry rather than systemically, which means his body is winning the fight barely. The corner prisoner breaks their usual silence to share information. "Third cellmate I've had get the thumb screws. First one died, infection went to his heart. Second one lived but lost both thumbs to gangrene. The surgeon cut them off with a blade heated in fire, no other pain treatment." They're providing Philippe with a statistical baseline: 1 in 3 die, 1 in 3 lose the digits permanently, 1 in 3 keep damaged but functional hands. These are the odds calculated from small sample size but probably representative. Philippe takes this information with minimal reaction. He's past the point where odds matter. He's simply enduring moment-to-moment breathing through pain, existing because stopping isn't actually an option his body will grant him. Suicide in the dungeon is theoretically possible, but practically difficult when you can barely move your arms and every action requires energy you don't possess. Medieval Christian theology made suicide particularly complicated, declaring it a mortal sin that condemned the soul to hell, regardless of prior virtue. This wasn't just abstract theology, it was social engineering that made despair itself a crime, ensuring that even prisoners who'd lost everything still feared losing their immortal soul. The Church understood psychological control remarkably well, even if they wouldn't have used that terminology. A 1289 coroner's report from Gloucester Prison notes, "One prisoner discovered to have ended his own life by means of his chains, having wrapped them about his neck and thrown himself forward." The report's tone is disapproving rather than sympathetic, treating the suicide as an additional crime, rather than the desperate act of someone who'd exceeded their capacity to endure. The prisoner's body was denied church burial, instead being buried at a crossroads, with a stake through the heart treatment, reserved for suicides and vampires categories that medieval thinking saw as related. You're learning the dungeon's full curriculum now: pain, cold, hunger, and the knowledge that relief won't come from outside intervention, but only from your body's surrender to death, or to adaptation that borders on death. Philippe is discovering which path his body will choose. The corner prisoner has already chosen and exists in that liminal space where life continues, but vitality has departed. Edmund maintains his steady competence, the merchant's practical mindset that treats each challenge as a problem requiring solution, rather than a catastrophe requiring despair. He portions the bread to ensure Philippe gets extra calories for healing. He monitors wounds with the attention a craftsman gives to tools. He maintains conversation because silence in the darkness breeds madness faster than cold breeds infection. Thomas arrives with a daily ration and barely glances at Philippe. Wounded prisoners are common enough that they don't merit additional attention unless they die, at which point they become paperwork a body to remove a cell space that becomes available an entry in the ledger, marking one less mouth to feed. The economic calculation continues regardless of human cost. The corner prisoner returns to their standing position in the angle where walls meet, having spent their 2 shillings on 3 hours of sky, and the sight of someone dying with fire instead of cold. Whether this was worth the cost they don't say, but they seem marginally more present, as if the execution reminded them that the world above still turns, still conducts its brutal business, still transforms living people into cautionary lessons. And Philippe breathes through another day's shoulders, screaming, thumbs throbbing, learning that survival isn't victory but simply the absence of death, which has to be enough because nothing else is available. On your 8th day, you're counting by bread deliveries now, the only reliable measure of time. Philippe begins speaking. Not to anyone in particular, just speaking into the darkness, words tumbling out in a monotone that suggests his mind has found the only escape available when the body can't flee. He's confessing everything. Things he did, things he witnessed, things he imagined, all flowing together in a stream of consciousness admission that makes no distinction between crime and thought, reality and fantasy. I stole apples from the orchard when I was 7. I lied to my tutor about reading Cicero. I watched my sister through the bathhouse window when I was 12. I wanted my father dead so I could inherit. I wished plague on the tax collector. I touched myself thinking about the miller's daughter. I blasphemed when I caught my thumb in a door. I doubted God when my brother died. I hated. I lusted. I coveted. I sinned. I sinned. I sinned. Edmund tries to interrupt to tell Philippe he doesn't need to confess to cellmates who aren't priests and can't grant absolution, but Philippe doesn't stop. This is what torture does when it works too well. It breaks the seal that normally contains human thoughts, turning the mind inside out until every shameful memory, every dark impulse, every moment of weakness comes spilling forth without filter. The interrogators wanted specific confession to specific crimes. They've created instead a confession machine that can't distinguish between betraying co-conspirators and admitting childhood apple theft. Medieval concepts of confession were complicated by the requirement that it be both voluntary and complete. Torture-extracted confession was legally valid. The Church and Crown agreed on this, but theologians worried about whether coerced admission achieved genuine spiritual cleansing. A 1247 papal bull attempted to resolve this by declaring that confession under duress was valid for legal purposes, but required subsequent voluntary confession to a priest for spiritual efficacy. This allowed everyone to maintain the fiction that justice was served, while acknowledging that torture corrupted the sacrament. Philippe's stream of confession continues for hours, cycling through his entire life, finding fault in every action, reinterpreting every choice as evidence of his fundamental corruption. This is what trauma does to memory. It poisons the past, making even innocent moments seem like proof of guilt. The child who stole apples becomes evidence that criminality was present all along. The teenage sexuality becomes perversion. The normal human emotions become mortal sins. You recognize this as psychological breakdown, though you lack vocabulary to name it precisely. The self is dissolving the boundary between Philippe the person and Philippe the collection of sins becoming porous. If this continues, he'll lose coherence, entirely becoming one of those prisoners who stare at nothing and respond to nothing, technically alive but effectively absent. The corner prisoner intervenes unexpectedly. They cross the cell, first time you've seen them leave their corner since they returned from the execution, and place their hand over Philippe's mouth. Not violently, just firmly stopping the words. Philippe's eyes go wide, but he stops talking. The corner prisoner holds their hand there for perhaps 30 seconds, then removes it slowly. "You're not confessing," the corner prisoner says, voice carrying absolute authority. "You're breaking. Stop breaking. We need you less broken." It's the most words they've spoken consecutively since you arrived, and the bluntness is somehow more effective than Edmund's gentle reassurance. Philippe blinks, processes, and something behind his eyes shifts. He's still devastated, still traumatized, but the compulsive confession stops. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood psychological trauma as a distinct phenomenon, or whether they simply categorized it under existing frameworks of sin, demonic possession, or divine punishment. Medical texts describe symptoms that align with what we'd call PTSD, intrusive thoughts, avoidance behaviors, hypervigilance, emotional numbing. They prescribe treatments ranging from prayer to herbal remedies to bloodletting with unpredictable efficacy. A 1314 account describes a knight who returned from crusade unable to sleep without screaming, refusing to enter enclosed spaces, and startling at sudden sounds as if arrows still flew. The chronicler attributes this to demons following him from the Holy Land, but the description is clearly trauma response. The knight eventually entered a monastery where the regulated hours and quiet contemplation brought some measure of peace, though he never fully recovered his former self. Philippe isn't going to enter a monastery. He's going to stay in this cell until trial, then execution or release, or transfer to another facility depending on factors entirely beyond his control. His recovery, if that word even applies, must happen here in darkness, surrounded by rats and cold, and the memories of what was done to his body. Edmund returns to his practical approach. You need to eat. Your body needs fuel to heal. He offers Philippe bread from the daily ration, and Philippe takes it mechanically chewing without apparent awareness of what he's eating. This is progress, the body's needs overriding the mind's chaos. Trauma or not metabolism continues demanding calories. You find yourself wondering about the interrogators, the men who did this to Philippe. Were they specialists trained in the art of extracting confession? Were they soldiers supplementing their income with torture shifts? Were they true believers who thought they were serving God by breaking heretics? Medieval records provide frustratingly little psychological insight into the torturers themselves, treating them as functionaries rather than individuals, tools of justice, rather than people who went home to families after spending days listening to screaming. A 1308 interrogator's manual provides one glimpse. The examiner must maintain composure and detachment, lest sympathy corrupt judgment. Remember that the body's pain serves the soul's salvation, and temporary suffering prevents eternal damnation. This is the logic that allowed otherwise normal people to systematically torture others. They'd convinced themselves it was mercy violence in service of grace, cruelty that served love. Philippe has stopped the compulsive confession, but remains fragile, liable to shatter again if additional stress appears. And additional stress will appear, it always does down here. The question is whether he's built enough psychological scar tissue to withstand it, or whether the next crisis will finish what the torture started. The corner prisoner returns to their angle, having expended their intervention quota. They've revealed something about themselves in that moment. They're not as far gone as they appear, not completely dissolved into the dungeon's darkness. Some core of them remains intact, capable of recognizing when another prisoner approaches the point of no return, and pulling them back from the edge. Edmund catches your eye in the darkness and nods slightly, acknowledging that Philippe has been retrieved from whatever abyss he was falling into. Small victories down here consist of preventing additional deterioration rather than achieving actual improvement. You don't get better in the dungeon, you just get less worse, which has to count as success because nothing else is available. Thomas arrives with the evening bread. Wait, was there a morning delivery you missed? Time has become even more slippery than usual. He looks at Philippe, still functional enough to receive rations, and shows no reaction to the young man's obvious trauma. Broken prisoners are standard inventory, nothing worth noting, unless they stop eating entirely or start attacking cellmates. The bread is distributed, the water is drunk, the rats investigate the possibility of dropped crumbs, the dripping water continues its percussion against stone, and Philippe sits with his mangled hands and dislocated then reduced shoulders alive despite everything breathing, despite pain existing in that space between survival and surrender that defines dungeon life. You're all broken to some degree now. The differences are just in how recently the breaking occurred and how thoroughly the pieces have been scattered. Philippe is freshly shattered. Edmund has old fractures that healed wrong but healed. The corner prisoner is mosaic pieces held together by will or habit or simple biological momentum. And you're developing your first cracks, feeling the pressure points, where the dungeon's architecture is designed to split you open. Welcome to the confession that never ends, the admission of guilt that torture extracts and trauma perpetuates. Whether the crimes were real becomes irrelevant when the punishment is absolute. The hierarchy in your cell reveals itself gradually through small interactions you initially missed. Edmund isn't just the oldest, he's the authority figure, the one who makes decisions about resource allocation, wound care, and when to intervene in another prisoner's crisis. Philippe, despite his noble birth, occupies the lowest position, now his torture-induced fragility making him dependent on others' goodwill. The corner prisoner exists outside the hierarchy entirely neither dominant nor submissive, simply parallel to the social structure the rest of you inhabit. This microcosm reflects larger medieval social organization, but with crucial inversions. Outside these walls, Philippe's noble blood would grant him automatic superiority over Edmund the merchant. Inside, nobility means nothing when you can't use your hands to eat your own bread. The dungeon is a great equalizer, though not in any way the philosophical term usually implies it equalizes suffering, rather than opportunity, creating a community bound by shared misery rather than shared purpose. You watch Edmund make decisions, Philippe gets a slightly larger bread portion, because healing requires calories. The corner prisoner gets first access to the drainage channel, because they're the only one who never waste time managing their bodily functions with military efficiency. You get positioned in the middle of the warmth chain at night because you're neither as fragile as Philippe nor as self-sufficient as the corner prisoner. These aren't discussed or debated, Edmund simply implements them, and everyone accepts his authority, because the alternative is chaos in a space where chaos means death. Medieval prison records occasionally reference these informal hierarchies. A 1298 coroner's inquiry into a prison death notes that the deceased had been denied food by other prisoners who claimed his weakness endangered them all. This was probably accurate in overcrowded cells where resources were scarce. A prisoner too weak to maintain hygiene or control their bowels became a threat to everyone's survival. The informal execution by starvation was brutal pragmatism, survival logic stripped of sentiment. But your cell hasn't reached that point yet. Edmund's leadership includes rather than excludes recognizing that Philippe's vulnerability could be anyone's tomorrow, that the corner prisoner's silence doesn't mean they're worthless, that even you, newest and least useful, deserve basic consideration. This is communal survival at its functional best. Humans remembering that cooperation beats competition when everyone's already losing. The social dynamics shift when Thomas arrives with news. Trial date set, 2 weeks. He's addressing Philippe, whose face shows no reaction. 2 weeks means 14 more days of this, 14 more nights of cold and pain, 14 more cycles of bread and water, and the slow healing that may not complete before he's dragged to whatever passes for justice in medieval courts. What are the charges? Edmund asks, though he probably knows the answer doesn't matter much. Thomas shrugs. Heresy, conspiracy, the usual. The casual dismissiveness reveals how standardized this process has become. Individual guilt or innocence is irrelevant machinery in a system designed to process bodies through predetermined outcomes. Philippe's confession, extracted through torture, probably fabricated entirely, will be read as evidence. His noble birth might earn him beheading instead of burning if his family can pay the premium for merciful execution. Or he might simply disappear into this dungeon permanently, his trial postponed indefinitely while he rots in darkness. Medieval legal procedure varied wildly by region and time period, but certain patterns held consistent confession was nearly essential for conviction. In serious crimes, torture was legally sanctioned to obtain confession, and the accused bore the burden of proving innocence rather than the state proving guilt. This inverted modern assumptions about justice, creating a system where imprisonment itself became presumptive evidence of wrongdoing. Historians still argue whether medieval people recognize the circularity of this logic. You're imprisoned because you're suspected, tortured, because you're imprisoned and convicted because you confessed under torture, or whether they genuinely believe the system revealed truth. Some evidence suggests awareness. A 1215 church council condemned judicial torture, and various royal proclamations attempted to regulate its use. But these reforms were honoured more in the breach than the observance, suggesting that everyone understood torture was problematic, while also being too useful to abandon. Philippe's trial will be theatre performance of justice rather than pursuit of it. The judges know the outcome before it begins. The confession extracted in the oubliette provides the script. Philippe's role is to stand, or more likely kneel, given his injuries and acknowledge his crimes, while the court demonstrates its authority to name evil and punish it. Whether he actually did anything heretical or conspiratorial is a question nobody will seriously investigate. Edmund has witnessed this process before you can tell, from how he explains it to Philippe voice carrying the weary authority of experience. They'll read your confession. You'll be asked to confirm it. If you recant, they'll torture you again until you stop recanting. If you confirm it, they'll pronounce sentence. The whole thing takes maybe an hour. And then Philippe's voice is barely audible. Depends on what they want. Death probably given the heresy charge, or maybe perpetual imprisonment if your family negotiates well and pays generously. Edmund doesn't sugarcoat it. Down here, honesty is the only kindness that costs nothing. The corner prisoner speaks from their angle. I've been awaiting trial for 3 years, or maybe 4. The date gets set, then postponed, then set again. Eventually you stop counting. They're describing indefinite detention imprisonment without resolution, the legal limbo that sometimes lasted until the prisoner died, or the authorities forgot why they'd been arrested in the first place. A 1342 petition from London prisoners complained to Parliament that many languish for years without trial, their crimes forgotten, their accusers dead, their witnesses dispersed, yet they were often imprisoned as if the iron of their chains was proof sufficient of guilt. The petition resulted in reforms that lasted approximately 6 months before administrative convenience reasserted itself over legal principle. You're witnessing the medieval justice system's fundamental truth. It exists to maintain order through intimidation rather than to determine guilt through investigation. The dungeon, the torture, the trial, these are all theatrical elements in a performance designed to remind the population that challenging authority leads to suffering. Whether any individual prisoner deserves their fate is irrelevant to the system's larger purpose. Philippe absorbs this information, silently processing the knowledge that his future has already been decided by people he'll never meet based on confessions extracted through methods that would make strong men weep. His noble birth won't save him. If anything, it makes him more valuable as a demonstration that nobody's above the law, or more accurately, that everyone is beneath it. Edmund returns to the practical 2 weeks. We keep your wounds clean, get your strength up as much as possible. You'll need to stand for the trial, and fainting suggests guilt somehow. Medieval logic. He's already planning treating Philippe's survival as a project with concrete steps and achievable goals, because the alternative is surrendering to despair, and Edmund seems constitutionally incapable of surrender. The corner prisoner adds unexpected advice. Don't hope for justice. Hope for competent executioners if it comes to that. The difference between a clean death and a botched one is everything when you're the one dying. They're speaking from observation. They've watched executions, possibly many, and know that even death has quality gradations in medieval contexts. You're learning the hierarchy's final lesson. Your position in the cell matters far less than your position in the larger system of power that put you here. Inside, Edmund's practical leadership creates minimal order and maximal survival. Outside forces you can't see and can't influence are determining whether you live or die, and nothing you do in this cell will change those determinations. Thomas leaves with his usual indifference, and the 4 of you settle back into the dungeon's rhythm. Philippe, with his countdown to trial Edmund, with his steady management of daily survival, the corner prisoner with their infinite patience for indefinite imprisonment, and you, with your growing understanding that the dungeon isn't the worst part of medieval justice, it's just the waiting room for whatever comes next. On day 12, or possibly 13, the bread deliveries have started blurring together. Philippe develops a fever. It starts as mild warmth when Edmund checks his forehead, then escalates over hours into shaking chills despite the cell's baseline cold. His wounds, particularly the thumbs, have turned an angry red that's spreading up his forearms in thin lines. Edmund recognizes what you're all witnessing, blood-poisoning infection that's entered his circulation and is now touring his body looking for vital organs to colonize. We need to drain the thumbs, Edmund announces, examining the swollen, discoloured flesh. The infection has to come out or it'll reach his heart. He's describing medieval surgery with medieval tools, which is to say no surgery and no tools, just improvisation using whatever's available, which is almost nothing. The corner prisoner produces another surprise from their mysterious clothing layers. A small piece of metal may be part of a broken nail, filed to a rough edge against stone over countless hours. It's barely sterile, nothing down here is sterile, but it's sharp enough to pierce skin, which makes it the best surgical implement available. Edmund holds it in his own mouth for several minutes, saliva providing the closest approximation to disinfection that exists in this context. Philippe is conscious, but barely fever, creating a dissociation that might actually be helpful for what's coming. Edmund positions the metal at the nail bed of Philippe's right thumb, where infection has created a pocket of pus beneath the blackened nail. "This will hurt," he says unnecessarily, then presses the metal point into flesh. Philippe screams, the sound echoing off stone with crystalline clarity. Pus erupts from the wound, thick and yellow-green, carrying the distinct smell of infection that makes you gag. Edmund squeezes the thumb systematically, forcing out as much infected material as possible, while Philippe thrashes weakly, too depleted by fever to mount effective resistance. The corner prisoner holds Philippe's arm steady, preventing him from pulling away from treatment that's agonizing but necessary. Medieval medical understanding of infection was primitive but not entirely wrong. They knew that corrupt matter needed removal, that red lines spreading from wounds meant danger, that fever indicated the body's fight against something harmful. What they didn't know was bacterial mechanics, antibiotic treatment, or sterile technique. They worked with the knowledge that drainage sometimes helped cauterization, sometimes worked, and prayer was always appropriate whether or not it affected outcomes. A 1289 surgical text advises, For wounds that corrupt and swell with foul humours, lance deeply and press forth all foulness. Apply honey and wine, bind with clean cloth if available. If red lines climb toward the heart, prepare for death and call a priest. The instructions are practical within their limitations, acknowledging that sometimes medieval medicine could only manage dying rather than prevent it. Edmund moves to the left thumb, repeating the process. More screaming, more pus, more of that distinct smell that will linger in your nostrils for days. When both thumbs have been drained, he uses water from his personal ration. The sacrifice is enormous, representing hours of thirst to wash away the worst of the discharge. The corner prisoner offers their relatively clean cloth strip again, and Edmund tears it to create fresh bandages for wounds that are now actively bleeding but at least no longer sealed containers of infection. Philippe has passed out, which is merciful. His body can fight fever more effectively when consciousness isn't draining additional resources. Edmund monitors his breathing, counting the rate checking for the rapid shallow pattern that would indicate pneumonia or the irregular gasping that suggests system-wide shutdown. The breathing is fast but steady, which means Philippe's body is still fighting with resources. It doesn't have burning through calories he can't replace, waging a war against bacteria using an immune system weakened by starvation and cold. Will he die? You ask, though you already know Edmund can't answer with certainty. Probably, Edmund says, which is more honest than comforting. The infection might be too established, or it might respond to the drainage. Medieval medicine is mostly probability and prayer, and the probabilities aren't good down here. He's giving you the statistical reality. Most serious infections in dungeons proved fatal. The combination of malnutrition, cold, and contaminated environment overwhelming whatever innate immunity prisoners possessed. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood that dungeon conditions actively killed prisoners, or whether they attributed deaths to individual weakness, divine judgment, or bad humours. Prison mortality rates were documented with bureaucratic precision. A 1301 survey of London prisons noted that approximately 30% of prisoners died before trial. But whether authorities viewed this as acceptable losses or preventable tragedy varied by individual administrator. The corner prisoner returns to their position but remains visibly present in a way they usually aren't, tracking Philippe's condition with focus that suggests personal investment. Maybe they've seen this before, watched previous cellmates fight infections they couldn't beat. Maybe Philippe's youth evokes some protective instinct they thought the dungeon had stripped away. Or maybe they're just calculating survival odds, determining whether Philippe's death would affect the cell's social dynamics in ways that matter. Philippe's fever continues through the night, his body temperature oscillating between burning hot and shivering cold, as his immune system fights with medieval inefficiency. Edmund wakes you every few hours to help reposition him, preventing pressure sores from forming on his already damaged shoulders. The corner prisoner contributes by keeping rats away from the wounded, unconscious body. They've developed some technique for discouraging rodent interest, maybe just the force of their attention, maybe something more active you don't observe in the darkness. Medieval nursing consisted largely of these small interventions, repositioning to prevent complications, maintaining hydration when possible, monitoring for signs of impending death, so priests could be called for last rites. The care was often competent within its limitations, hampered not by lack of compassion, but by absence of effective treatments. Watching someone die slowly from infection, while being unable to help beyond basic comfort measures, was standard medieval experience in dungeons and wealthy households alike. Morning brings Thomas with bread, and he notices Philippe's condition immediately. "Dead?" he asks Edmund. "Not yet." Thomas considers this. "Let me know when he is. Bodies don't remove themselves." He's not being cruel, just efficient, already calculating the logistics of corpse disposal and cell reassignment. Medieval administration reduced human suffering to paperwork problems, One dead prisoner equals one body disposal task, plus one available cell space, minus one daily bread ration. The math was simple, even if the humanity was complicated. Edmund divides Philippe's bread ration among the three of you still conscious. Philippe can't eat, and the calories will just rot if left uneaten. The pragmatism is brutal, but correct sentimentality doesn't survive long in environments where every calorie matters. You eat your portion, and Philippe's share mechanically fuel for a body that needs to maintain itself regardless of emotional state. The corner prisoner speaks, "Fifth cellmate I've watched die. You never get used to it, but you stop being surprised." They're offering context, letting you know that what's happening to Philippe is standard dungeon curriculum, a lesson in mortality that everyone down here eventually learns either by observation or experience. Philippe breathes shallowly through the day fever persisting despite Edmund's interventions. The drained wounds look marginally better, less swollen, though still angry and red. The red lines spreading up his arms have stopped advancing, which might mean the infection is contained, or might just mean it's consolidated in his bloodstream, preparing for a final assault on vital organs. You're watching someone die by degrees life, draining away in a process that takes days instead of moments. Medieval death was often like this, slow observable, providing time for farewells and final confessions, and the spiritual preparations that medieval Christianity considered essential. Fast death was actually problematic. It denied the dying person opportunity to confess sins, receive absolution, and prepare their soul for judgment. But Philippe is unconscious, unable to confess or prepare, and there's no priest available anyway. If he dies unshriven, whatever sins he carried, going with him to whatever medieval afterlife awaited. The theology was clear: dying without confession, risk damnation, regardless of prior virtue. The practice was messy. Many people died suddenly or unconsciously, and the church developed elaborate justifications for why God might grant mercy anyway. Edmund continues his vigil, checking Philippe's vitals, periodically adjusting his position, monitoring the wounds for signs of improvement or deterioration. It's all he can do, and he does it with the steady competence that defines his character. Some people break in the dungeon, some people adapt. Edmund has apparently chosen adaptation, maintaining humanity through small acts of care that serve no personal interest but fulfill some internal requirement for continued self-respect. Night arrives. Philippe still breathes, the fever still burns, and the three of you wait in darkness to see whether tomorrow brings recovery or requires corpse removal. Philippe survives the night, though survives is perhaps too generous a term for what he's become. The fever breaks on day 15, leaving him conscious but hollowed out. His eyes carrying the blank expression of someone who's travelled too close to death and returned missing essential pieces. He can speak but often doesn't. He can eat but shows no interest in food beyond mechanical acceptance when Edmund places bread in his functioning hand. The torture broke his body. The infection broke something else. Call it spirit, it will call it whatever animating force separates living people from biological machines that happen to be breathing. He's gone mad, you suggest to Edmund during one of Philippe's long silences. Not mad, Edmund corrects. Absent. There's a difference. Mad people are still present, just experiencing different reality. Absent people have retreated so far inside themselves they're barely accessible from outside. He's describing dissociation, the mind circuit breaker that trips when reality becomes unbearable, creating psychological distance from trauma that the body can't physically escape. Medieval medicine had terminology for this condition: melancholia. When it presented as withdrawal and sadness, acedia. When it manifested as spiritual apathy, loss of soul, when it seemed beyond medical treatment entirely. Monks sometimes experienced it after prolonged fasting and isolation. describing feeling disconnected from their own bodies, watching themselves from outside functioning but not inhabiting their functions. The condition was recognized even if the mechanism wasn't understood. The corner prisoner has seen this before clearly. They approach Philippe during one of his blank stares and speak directly into his face. "You're still here. The part that's hiding needs to know you're still here." Philippe's eyes track toward the sound but don't quite focus. The corner prisoner persists. "I was absent for 6 months. Came back eventually. Not all the way, but enough. You will too, or you won't, but right now you're still here." This is the most personal disclosure the corner prisoner has offered, revealing that their current detachment isn't original personality, but acquired defense mechanism that they too travelled this path of psychological retreat, and emerged changed but functional. Their current state, emotionally distant, verbally sparse, perpetually isolated, represents what recovery looks like when it happens in a dungeon, rather than a monastery or healing sanctuary. Philippe makes a sound that might be acknowledgement. Small progress, the tiniest indication that some part of him registers external input. Edmund takes this as encouragement and begins a systematic effort to pull Philippe back, asking questions that require responses, making him participate in cell routines, refusing to let him fully withdraw into the safer space inside his own head. "What's your mother's name?" Edmund asks. Silence, then barely audible, "Catherine." "Where is your family's estate?" Longer silence. "Burgundy, near Boone." "What do they grow there?" This time Philippe's eyes focus slightly. "Grapes. Wine grapes. Red." He's accessing memories, pulling information from before the trauma, exercising cognitive functions that dissociation attempts to shut down. It's primitive therapy, the kind that happens when trained practitioners don't exist, but humans still recognize that connection matters, that isolation kills even when the body continues functioning. Medieval religious orders actually developed sophisticated understanding of this phenomenon, particularly orders that emphasize solitary prayer and contemplation. A 1247 manual for anchorites, religious hermits who lived in permanent isolation, warns that excessive solitude can lead to spiritual dryness and separation from God's presence, whereby the soul becomes as dead though the body lives. The manual prescribes regular conversation with spiritual advisors, engagement with scripture, and structured daily routines as preventatives. Philippe is receiving the dungeon version of these treatments, Edmund's persistent engagement, structured participation in meal distribution and sleeping arrangements, and the corner prisoner's occasional interventions when absence threatens to become permanent. It's not sophisticated care, but it's care and down here that distinction matters more than methodology. Over the next several days, Philippe gradually resurfaces, not to his previous state that Philippe died in the oubliette, but to something functional enough to maintain basic self-care and minimal social interaction. He still has periods of extended silence, where his eyes go blank, and he seems to stop processing external stimuli. But he returns more quickly, now responds to his name more consistently, and occasionally initiates conversation rather than just responding to prompts. The trial is tomorrow, Thomas announces one morning bread delivery accompanied by this administrative update. Philippe shows minimal reaction, which is probably healthy, given that strong reaction would just be additional trauma with no useful outlet. Edmund nods acknowledgement. The corner prisoner doesn't respond at all. They've heard too many trial announcements that got postponed or cancelled to invest emotional energy in this one. The trial happens not in a grand courtroom, but in a chamber adjacent to the dungeon itself, a convenience that saves the trouble of transporting shackled prisoners through the castle. Thomas and 2 other guards lead Philippe away mid-morning, and he goes passively, offering no resistance, because resistance requires will he no longer possesses in sufficient quantity. The shuffle of his chains fades down the corridor. The door clangs shut, and Edmund and you and the corner prisoner wait to see if Philippe returns or if the cell just gained a vacancy. He returns 3 hours later unchanged in any visible way. The trial happened, sentences were pronounced, and Philippe's fate has been determined by people who never looked at him as human, just as case file, confession document, administrative problem requiring resolution. He shuffles back to his usual spot against the wall and sits without speaking. "Well," Edmund eventually prompts. "Perpetual imprisonment," Philippe says, voice flat. "My mother paid, enough to avoid execution, not enough to buy release. I'll die here eventually, just not by fire or blade." He's describing a sentence that's simultaneously merciful and horrifying. His life has been purchased, but his freedom hasn't, creating indefinite detention that will end only when disease or despair or time finally finishes what torture started. Medieval perpetual imprisonment was exactly what it sounds like. Incarceration until death with no possibility of release short of royal pardon or successful prison break. Some prisoners served these sentences for decades, growing old in cells, their crimes forgotten by everyone except the ledgers that kept them legally bound to their confinement. A 1318 record mentions a prisoner released after 27 years of perpetual imprisonment because the new king granted general amnesty at his coronation. The prisoner was 63, had entered at 36, and had spent more than half his adult life in darkness. Philippe has received simultaneously the best and worst possible outcome. He won't be executed, but he'll never leave. His shoulders will heal imperfectly, his thumbs will scar and function poorly, and he'll spend years, possibly decades, in this 8x8 stone box eating mouldy bread, sleeping on cold floors, and slowly forgetting what sunlight feels like on skin that isn't being marched to torture or execution. The corner prisoner speaks, "Welcome to the long game. It's different from waiting for trial. Worse in some ways, better in others. At least you know now." They're offering orientation to perpetual imprisonment, the veteran inducting the newcomer into a club nobody wants to join. Edmund places a hand on Philippe's shoulder, the one that's healed enough to tolerate touch, and says nothing, because there's nothing to say that wouldn't be either false comfort or cruel truth. Philippe has joined the forgotten ones, the prisoners who will live and die in the dungeon's darkness, while the world above continues forgetting they exist. You're watching transformation, in real time, Philippe the nobleman becoming Philippe the permanent prisoner identity, reforming around new permanent reality. The person he was before arrest is dead. The person torture created has been sentenced to indefinite existence, and whoever he becomes over the next years or decades will be shaped entirely by stone-cold darkness and the desperate human need for meaning, even when meaning has been systematically stripped away. The forgotten ones occupy a special category in the dungeon's hierarchy, and now Philippe has joined their ranks. These are prisoners whose names appear in ledgers, but nowhere else, people who've been administratively processed into permanent storage, human beings transformed into inventory items maintained at minimal cost until natural expiration. Thomas treats Philippe differently after the sentencing, not cruelly, but with the indifference reserved for things that have already been resolved, problems that no longer require attention because they've been filed in the permanent category. The corner prisoner was already forgotten. You realise this now, understanding that their 3 years or 4, they've lost count, represents exactly what Philippe faces, decades of sameness, broken only by the micro-variations in daily suffering. How old is the corner prisoner? Impossible to tell beneath the accumulated grime and the posture of someone who's stopped caring about bodies as anything except vehicles for consciousness that's barely holding on. Edmund hasn't been sentenced yet, which places him in a different category, the awaiting the uncertain, the prisoners who still have reason to track time and maintain hope for eventual resolution. His brother is gathering money, his trial hasn't been scheduled, he exists in limbo, which is psychologically different from Philippe's certainty, or the corner prisoner's timelessness. Edmund still counts days. The forgotten ones stop counting because the numbers cease to matter when they'll never reach an endpoint. Medieval record-keeping preserved some forgotten prisoners in administrative amber. A 1302 survey of English prisons mentions one William imprisoned these 14 years for theft, his term being perpetual, maintained at cost of 3 pence per week. That's all. No surname, no crime details, no indication of whether William was alive or dead when the survey was conducted. Just an entry in a ledger, a line item in a budget proof that a person once existed and might still exist, and nobody particularly cares which. Some of these prisoners developed reputations that spread through the dungeon by whisper and rumour. The corner prisoner mentions one. 2 levels down, there's a man who's been here since before I arrived. 30 years, maybe more. Doesn't speak anymore, but he's still alive. The guards feed him like you'd feed livestock, and he eats. That's the extent of his existence. Philippe absorbs this information with the expression of someone calculating his own trajectory. Will he be that man in 30 years? Will he lose speech, lose personality, lose everything except the biological imperative to keep breathing? The question doesn't have a good answer, so Edmund redirects. Some forgotten prisoners maintain themselves remarkably well. I've heard of a scholar imprisoned for heresy who spent 20 years translating texts in his head, memorizing entire books to keep his mind active. When he was finally released, some political shift made his heresy irrelevant. He could recite Aristotle complete from memory. This story might be apocryphal, but its purpose isn't historical accuracy. Edmund is providing Philippe with a survival framework. Your mind is the territory that remains unconquered if you defend it actively, deliberatively, with the same energy you'd use to defend physical property from invaders. The dungeon gets your body automatically. Your mind requires a fight to claim. What did you do? Philippe asks the corner prisoner directly first time he's initiated conversation with them. To survive this long, what did you do? The corner prisoner considers for a long moment. Stopped trying to survive, started just existing. Survival implies future orientation. You survive for something coming later. Existence is present tense. Breathe now, eat now, sleep now, repeat. No anticipation, no memory, just the continuous present. They're describing a Buddhist-like mindfulness achieved not through spiritual practice, but through necessity, the mind's adaptation to circumstances where future hope and past memory both cause suffering. Historians still argue whether medieval prisoners developed these coping strategies deliberately, or whether they emerged unconsciously from prolonged confinement. Some monastic literature suggests awareness of similar techniques. Live each hour as if it contains all time, neither regretting the past nor anticipating the future, but dwelling fully in God's eternal present. Whether the corner prisoner would articulate it theologically or not, they've achieved something similar, perpetual nowness that minimizes suffering by refusing to contextualize it within larger narrative frameworks. Philippe tries to understand, so you just stopped caring? No, the corner prisoner corrects. Caring requires energy I need for breathing. I stopped hoping, which is different. Hope is expensive. Costs calories you don't have. Existence is cheap. Your body already knows how to do it without instruction. This is the forgotten one's wisdom, hard won through years of darkness. Hope is a luxury that malnutrition and cold and endless monotony make unaffordable. Existence becomes the sole achievable goal, stripped of meaning beyond its own continuation. It sounds like despair, and maybe it is, but it's functional despair that allows consciousness to persist when conditions make persistence seem irrational. Edmund objects gently. But some prisoners do get released, some sentences get commuted. Hope isn't always false. hope for the uncertain like you, the corner prisoner allows, not for the forgotten like us. They're drawing the categorical line. Clearly Edmund still occupies the space where hope is statistically justified, however marginally. Felipe has crossed into territory where hope becomes self-torture, a fantasy that makes present suffering worse by contrasting it with impossible futures. A 1287 chronicle describes a prisoner who maintained elaborate plans for life after release throughout 15 years of perpetual imprisonment, decorating his cell walls with scratched calendars and calculations, speaking constantly about what he'd do when freed. When a royal pardon actually arrived, pure luck, a general amnesty for unrelated political reasons, the prisoner couldn't integrate the information. He had invested so completely in imprisoned identity that freedom became unintelligible. He reportedly died within weeks of release, unable to function in the world he'd spent 15 years imagining. Philippe is receiving two competing philosophies: Edmund's maintenance of hope and forward-thinking, the corner prisoner's radical acceptance of perpetual present. Both are survival strategies. Both work for some people. Felipe will have to determine which, if either, suits his particular psychological architecture. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," Felipe admits, and the honesty is probably healthy. He's not pretending to have answers, he lacks not performing strength he doesn't feel. Just acknowledging that perpetual imprisonment has no instruction manual, no guidebook for maintaining sanity across decades of darkness. "You exist," the corner prisoner offers. "That's the only requirement. Everything else is optional." "You think," Edmund counters. "You remember. You plan. You maintain the parts of yourself that make you human rather than just biological machinery." Philippe sits between these philosophies, literally and metaphorically occupying the middle ground in the cell and in the existential question of how to be a person when personhood has been administratively cancelled. He'll synthesize his own approach eventually, or fail to, and dissolve into whatever non-state the forgotten ones achieve when they stop being individuals and become just occupancy entries in prison ledgers. You watch this learning lessons you never wanted about human adaptability and its limits. The dungeon is teaching everyone differently. Edmund learns through active maintenance of hope, the corner prisoner through radical acceptance of hopelessness, Philippe through forced choice between these poles, and you through observation of all three trajectories, wondering which will be yours if your own trial ends in permanent imprisonment rather than execution or release. Thomas arrives with bread, and his eyes pass over Philippe with the indifference reserved for inventory. The forgotten ones are already catalogued, already processed, requiring no additional administrative attention beyond daily feeding, until they stop requiring that too. Philippe takes his bread and eats mechanically fuel for a body that will continue functioning whether he wants it to or not, because biology doesn't care about sentencing or psychological state, it just demands calories and responds to their presence or absence with continuation or cessation. Welcome to the forgotten ones. Population increasing daily. Duration until death or political circumstance changes categories, whichever comes first. The probability strongly favours death. Your own trial arrives on day 23, though you've stopped trusting your count. Thomas appears with the announcement, "No warning, just you now." And suddenly you're being led through corridors you haven't seen since your initial descent. The torch creates dancing shadows that hurt your eyes after weeks of near-total darkness. Your legs shake from the exertion of walking more than the shuffle between wall and drainage channel. The world has become so small that navigating a corridor feels like expedition. The trial chamber is smaller than you imagined, barely larger than your cell, with 3 men seated behind a wooden table. No jury, no elaborate procedure, just administrators processing cases with the efficiency of merchants inventorying grain. Your charges are read from a document: theft assault on a crown officer, failure to pay debts resisting arrest. Some of these crimes you committed, some you didn't. All of them are now equally true in the legal record that matters more than actual events. Do you confess? The central judge asked, voice carrying bureaucratic boredom. You remember Philippe screaming the sounds that echoed from the oubliette, the transformed body that returned wrapped in trauma. You understand the unspoken part of the question, confess now, or confess later, after we've made confession seem like relief instead of surrender. Medieval justice doesn't particularly care which option you choose. Both lead to the same outcome, but one path involves significantly more suffering than the other. Yes, you hear yourself say. The word tastes like betrayal and survival simultaneously. Details. The judge prompts, and you provide them, inventing where memory fails, elaborating where truth is insufficient, creating a narrative that satisfies their requirements for specificity without actually corresponding to events you can verify. This is confession, as creative writing autobiography, as fiction, truth, as whatever the court needs to hear to move to the next case in their schedule. The sentencing takes less than a minute. You're neither important enough for execution nor wealthy enough to buy release. 7 years imprisonment, the judge pronounces, to be served in the Crown's facility at present location, rations to be maintained at standard rate, shackles to remain affixed throughout term, sentence to commence immediately. 7 years. The number is simultaneously specific and incomprehensible. 7 years ago you were a different person living a life you can barely remember, now making choices that led incrementally to this moment. 7 years forward is impossible to visualize. Will you survive 7 years in the cell? Will Philippe still be alive? Will Edmund ever get his trial? Or will he join the forgotten ones too? Will the corner prisoner still be standing in their angle? Or will they finally surrender to whatever final absence they've been postponing? Medieval 7-year sentences were considered moderate long enough to provide serious punishment, but short enough to avoid the category of forgotten ones. Some prisoners served them fully and emerged damaged but functional. Others died in years 2 or 3, their bodies unable to sustain the cumulative deprivation. The survival rate varied by facility time period and individual constitution, but historical records suggest approximately 40 to 50% of prisoners sentenced to terms of 5 to 10 years actually lived to see release. Thomas leads you back to your cell, and you notice details you missed during your initial arrival. The thickness of the walls, the strategic placement of barred windows that provide ventilation but no escape routes, the architectural decisions that transform simple stone into sophisticated containment technology. The dungeon isn't accidentally oppressive, it's deliberately engineered to break spirits through environmental pressure rather than active cruelty. Edmund Philippe and the corner prisoner look up when you return. You can see them calculating, trying to read your fate in your expression or posture, or the way you shuffle back to your space against the wall. 7 years, you say, because there's no point in delaying the information. Edmund nods. Survivable. I've heard of people completing 7-year sentences. He's offering probability, not certainty, but probability is better than nothing in a space where most futures are dark. Philippe says nothing, and you understand why your 7 years has an endpoint, a theoretical release date that creates temporal structure, even if you never live to see it. His perpetual imprisonment has no such structure. Your sentence is duration, his is condition. The difference matters psychologically, even if both might end in death from disease or despair before official terms conclude. The corner prisoner speaks. You'll learn. Everyone learns or dies trying, sometimes both. They're welcoming you to the graduated program, the prisoners who've moved from uncertain to sentenced, from awaiting to serving, from temporary to extended residence in the dungeon's architecture. Historians still argue whether medieval sentencing reflected genuine attempts at proportional justice, or simply administrative convenience dressed in legal language. 7 years for your crimes might be excessive by modern standards, Or it might be lenient by medieval measures where theft could earn hanging and assaulting crown officers could mean execution with embellishments. The system's internal logic is difficult to reconstruct from historical distance, but its effects are clear. You're now state property maintained at minimal cost, expected to survive, but not necessarily to thrive. The daily rhythm reasserts itself. Thomas brings bread and water. You eat mechanically. Philippe stares at nothing, practicing the corner prisoner's eternal present, or perhaps just dissociating from circumstances that exceed his capacity to process. Edmund maintains his routines, the small acts of structure that impose order on chaos. The corner prisoner remains in their angle, breathing existing, demonstrating what survival looks like when you've been at it long enough that technique replaces will. Night arrives, you think it's night. The window showing darkness, though the window sometimes lies. The four of you arrange yourselves for sleep. Edmund against the wall. Philippe curled in his minimal space. You finding position that balances circulation against cold. The corner prisoner maintaining their standing position that defies anatomy, but apparently works through some mechanism of adaptation. You haven't learned yet. 7 years. 2,555 days approximately, though you'll lose count within months. 73,000 hours, give or take. 4,380,000 minutes, each one requiring survival, none of them offering redemption or progress, or anything beyond continued existence. This is your sentence time measured not in meaningful units, but in breaths, bread rations, nights survived, moments endured. You think about the life you had before the choices that seemed important, then the problems that felt significant. All of it is irrelevant now, compressed into the administrative note that you exist, you're serving time, you consume resources at standard rate, you occupy cell space that's been allocated for your containment. You've been reduced to inventory, numbered and filed, maintained, but not valued. Philippe shifts in his sleep chains, scraping. Edmund's breathing deepens toward actual rest. The corner prisoner might be sleeping or meditating, or simply existing with eyes open in darkness impossible to tell, and they wouldn't clarify if asked. A rat investigates your foot, decides you're not dead or interesting, and moves on to more promising territory. This is your life now. This is what 7 years looks like at its beginning, identical today, one indistinguishable from yesterday, continuous with tomorrow, in ways that make temporal measurement meaningless. You're learning what the forgotten ones already know. Time in the dungeon isn't linear progression toward release, but circular repetition of sameness, until something breaks your body, your mind, or the administrative system that's keeping you here. You close your eyes, knowing sleep won't come easily, knowing that when it does, it will be fragmented and unsatisfying, knowing that morning, whenever it arrives, will bring only more of the same. 7 years of this, or until you die, whichever comes first. The statistics don't favour survival, but statistics are abstractions, and your concrete breathing existing in the continuous present, where mathematics can't predict which specific prisoners become percentages. Welcome to your sentence. Duration 7 years, or terminal, whichever the dungeon achieves first. The architecture has already started its patient work of determining that outcome. You wouldn't last a day as a prisoner in a medieval dungeon, not really, not if we're being honest. The person you are now reading this from comfort and safety possesses none of the calluses that medieval survival required. Your body expects 3 meals, climate control, medical care when illness strikes, and pain relief when suffering arrives. Your mind expects privacy, dignity, hope for tomorrow, and the assumption that systems exist to protect rather than destroy you. The dungeon provides none of these things, and the gap between expectation and reality would break you faster than the cold or hunger or torture ever could. Medieval prisoners who survived and remember most didn't possess or developed capacities that modern life has systematically eliminated from human experience. They could endure pain without medication, because medication didn't exist, so their nervous systems learned different relationships with suffering. They could survive on 1,200 calories daily because their metabolisms had never known abundance, so deprivation was variation rather than catastrophe. They could maintain sanity in darkness because their baseline existence included so much hardship that the dungeon was degree rather than kind of suffering. You don't have those capacities. Your body would rebel within hours at the cold demand food it couldn't receive, and develop infections from wounds that medieval immune systems might have fought off. Your mind would fragment under the combination of sensory deprivation, social isolation, and constant low-level threat that characterized dungeon existence. The architecture designed to break medieval people, who were already tougher than you by orders of magnitude, would shatter modern consciousness like dropping crystal on stone. Consider what you've learned through these sections. Philippa, young and noble, broke under torture and never fully reassembled. Edmund, practical and adaptable, survives through rigid routine and refusal to hope for more than tomorrow's bread. The corner prisoner exists in a state that's barely recognizable as life consciousness reduced to its minimal viable form. And you, the newest prisoner, have been sentenced to 7 years of this, a duration that would require becoming someone else entirely, someone harder, colder, less human, in ways that would horrify your current self. The medieval dungeon wasn't exceptional cruelty. It was standard practice, accepted methodology for maintaining order through systematic suffering. Thousands of prisoners experienced these conditions across centuries of European history. Most died. Some survived damaged. A few, very few, emerged intact enough to resume lives that resembled normalcy. The system functioned exactly as designed, breaking people efficiently economically, with minimal administrative overhead. But you transported from modern comfort into that stone box would lack even the preparation that medieval childhood provided. You've never been truly cold, the bone-deep hypothermia that medieval winters inflicted on prisoners and peasants alike. You've never been truly hungry, the cellular starvation that makes your body consume its own muscle tissue for fuel. You've never experienced pain without hope of relief suffering, without narrative that gives it meaning or endpoint that promises conclusion. The dungeon would teach these lessons, but you'd probably die during the instruction. Your immune system, trained on antibiotics and vaccines, would encounter medieval diseases without defense. Your psychology, structured around autonomy and choice, would collapse under absolute powerlessness. Your body, accustomed to ergonomic furniture and temperature control, would develop pressure sores, frostbite, and joint damage from sleeping on stone floors in positions that human anatomy wasn't designed to sustain. Even if you somehow survived the physical challenges, unlikely, but possible, the psychological damage would be permanent and profound. Modern prisoners in solitary confinement with lighting and temperature control and regular meals develop serious mental health issues within months. Medieval dungeon conditions were exponentially worse, darker, colder, more painful, more isolating, with no theoretical endpoint beyond death or arbitrary administrative decision. Your mind would adapt by fragmenting, dissociating, or simply shutting down non-essential functions, leaving you alive but absent in ways that modern psychiatric terminology struggles to classify. Thomas arrives one final time with bread and water, and you realize this routine oppressive, inadequate, brutal represents the dungeon's mercy. The food keeps you alive. The water prevents fatal dehydration. The regularity provides temporal structure in chaos. Without these minimal provisions, death would arrive within days. With them, you might survive months or years, which is either extended suffering or extended opportunity, depending on whether you've adopted Edmund's hope or the corner prisoner's acceptance. Philippe sleeps, or pretends to his damaged hands tucked against his chest in protective position that's become permanent posture. Edmund eats his bread, methodically rationing it across the day, with discipline born from experience. The corner prisoner receives their portion and consumes it without apparent thought fuel, entering a machine that continues operating, because stopping requires decision, and decision requires will. This is the reality you couldn't survive, not just the dramatic moments of torture or trial, but the endless succession of identical days where nothing happens except the slow erosion of everything that makes you yourself. The dungeon doesn't need to break you actively. It just needs to contain you long enough for time and deprivation to accomplish what violence would achieve less efficiently. The cold settles deeper as night approaches. Your 7-year sentence stretches ahead unmappable distance that might as well be infinite for all the meaning it carries in present darkness. You understand now what the corner prisoner meant about expensive hope. Every moment spent imagining release is a moment experiencing the gap between imagination and reality, suffering compounded by contrast with impossible futures. But perhaps some part of you would adapt. Perhaps the survival instinct that kept humans alive through ice ages and plagues and famines would activate, transforming you into something capable of enduring what seems unendurable from safe distance. Perhaps you discover reservoirs of resilience you don't know. You possess capacities that modern comfort has kept dormant but not eliminated. Or perhaps not. Perhaps you'd be among the 40 to 50% who died before completing their sentences. Another notation in the ledger, another body removed through the same corridor you entered, another vacancy in a cell that would be filled within days by the next prisoner learning these same lessons or failing to learn them fast enough to matter. The dungeon breathes around you, water dripping its eternal percussion rats conducting their business, stone-weeping moisture that never dries. This is the last sound you'd hear before sleep claims you, if sleep comes at all, and the first sound greeting you tomorrow morning, and the background soundtrack for 7 years, or until death, whichever arrives first. The architecture that broke Philippe and contained the corner prisoner, and tests Edmund daily, would test you too, and the outcome isn't certain, but the probability is clear. You wouldn't last a day, not because you're weak. Medieval prisoners weren't stronger, just differently calibrated. You wouldn't last because everything about modern existence has prepared you for a world that provides comfort choice and medical intervention. The medieval dungeon provides only darkness, cold, and time measured in suffering. The gap between these realities is unbridgeable without transformation so complete that the person who emerged, if anyone emerged, would share only biological continuity with the person who entered. Philippe stirs, makes the small sound that indicates pain has interrupted whatever passes for his rest. Edmund shifts position chains, scraping familiar rhythm. The corner prisoner remains motionless, existing in their eternal present, demonstrating what survival looks like when you've stopped expecting it to feel like anything except not dying. And you sit in darkness, newly sentenced, beginning to understand that 7 years isn't duration, but identity, not time you serve, but person you become. The dungeon doesn't just contain prisoners, it creates them, transforming whatever you were into, whatever can survive here, which is always something less than fully human, but occasionally something more resilient than you'd imagine possible. This is why you wouldn't last a day, not because medieval dungeons were uniquely horrible. Many modern prisons are comparably brutal, but because you lack the preparation, the conditioning, the biological and psychological calluses that medieval life built into people from birth. You're optimized for a world that includes rescue and relief. The dungeon offers neither, just continuation of suffering measured in years, and the honest assessment is that your body and mind would break long before 7 years could pass. But here in the darkness, with bread that tastes like mold and water that carries diseases you can't name, you're learning what the forgotten ones know. Sometimes lasting isn't about strength, but about accepting that weakness is permanent condition rather than temporary setback. Sometimes survival means becoming someone you wouldn't recognize, someone who can eat moldy bread without revulsion, Sleep on stone without complaint and exist in darkness, without meaning beyond simple continuation. Edmund finishes his bread and leans back against the weeping wall. Philippa breathes shallowly in dreams you hope are better than waking. The corner prisoner maintains their vigil, standing witness to another day survived by prisoners who technically live, but exist in states that challenge the definition of living. And you close your eyes against darkness that doesn't change whether your eyes are open or closed, understanding finally that the dungeon's cruelest feature isn't the cold or hunger or pain. It's the time, the endless succession of identical moments that must be endured without meaning or purpose or hope beyond simple biological persistence. That's what you couldn't survive, not the dramatic suffering, but the undramatic continuation of it day after day after day until 7 years pass or you die trying. The darkness settles now, thick as wool, heavy as memory. You feel it pressing against your chest, or maybe that's just your breathing slowing down, finding its rhythm with the stone's patient dripping. The rats have gone quiet, or perhaps you've simply stopped hearing them. Outside beyond these walls, the world continues. Markets open and close, seasons turn, children grow taller, bread bakes in warm kitchens. But down here, time doesn't flow forward, it pools, becomes something you move through, rather than something that moves past you. Philippe's breathing has deepened into something that might be peace, or might just be exhaustion too complete to call by any other name. Edmund shifts one final time, settling into position he's perfected over months, and you hear the small sigh that marks his surrender to another night. The corner prisoner remains standing or sitting or existing in whatever state they've discovered beyond the usual categories. It doesn't matter. What matters is the breathing, the simple fact of lungs filling and emptying, hearts beating their steady rhythm. Bodies maintaining themselves despite every reason to simply stop. You won't remember when consciousness leaves you tonight. Sleep in the dungeon arrives like fog rather than curtain, gradual dimming rather than clean transition. But it will come eventually because bodies have their requirements regardless of circumstances. And tomorrow there will be tomorrow won't there. You'll wake to the same darkness, the same cold, the same bread and water, an endless patience of stone that's been here centuries before you and will remain centuries after. The dungeon has taught its lessons about suffering's architecture, about survival's cost, about the distance between the person you were and the person you're becoming. Whether you learn these lessons or die from them, whether 7 years is duration you complete or promise that dies with you. These questions dissolve into the darkness that surrounds everything down here, making distinctions between future and past as irrelevant as the difference between tonight and tomorrow night. So rest now if you can. Let the stone hold you however coldly. Let the darkness cover you however completely. Let the breathing continue moment by moment, because that's all survival ever is. In places like this, the next breath and the next and the next, until finally there are no more breaths to take, or until rarely, so rarely the iron gate opens and someone who still remembers your name calls you back to the world of light. Until then, sleep, or try to. The dungeon doesn't mind either way, either. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.